Welcome, weary traveler. Find a comfortable position, let your eyes close gently, and allow yourself to drift as we journey together into one of Dark Souls' most haunting and tragic tales. Tonight, we explore the rise and fall of the four kings of New Londo, a story that begins in golden light and ends in the deepest darkness. There's something uniquely soothing about Dark Souls lore, isn't there? Perhaps it's the way these ancient stories unfold with the weight of ages behind them, or how they speak to timeless truths about ambition, corruption, and the price of power. As you listen, you don't need to hold on to every detail. Let the words wash over you like gentle waves, carrying you deeper into rest with each passing moment. The world of Lifedrain is a place of cycles, of ages that rise and fall like the tide. The Age of Fire, brought into being by Lord Gwyn and the other lords who discovered souls within the first flame, was meant to be eternal. But nothing truly lasts forever. Every flame must eventually dim, and every golden age carries within it the seeds of its own ending. New Londo was built during the brightest hours of the Age of Fire, when hope seemed limitless and humanity was reaching new heights of achievement. The city stood as a testament to what mortals could accomplish when blessed with divine favor and guided by wise leadership. Its towers reached toward the heavens, its architecture rivaled that of the gods themselves, and its people flourished under the guidance of four exceptional rulers. These four kings were not born to nobility. They earned their positions through wisdom, foresight, and leadership that transcended the ordinary bounds of human capability. Their names have been lost to history, consumed by the very darkness they would eventually embrace, but their story remains, a cautionary tale that echoes through the ages. As you relax more deeply, breathing slowly and steadily, imagine yourself standing at the edge of New Londo during its golden age. The sun is warm on your face, and you can hear the distant sounds of a thriving city. Merchants calling out their wares, children laughing in the streets, the ring of hammers on anvils as craftsmen ply their trade. This is a place of peace, of prosperity, of hope. But beneath this idyllic surface, forces were stirring. Ancient powers that predated even the Age of Fire itself were beginning to take notice of this shining city and its remarkable rulers. The abyss, the primordial darkness from which all things emerged before the coming of the first flame, was watching and waiting. Our story tonight will take us from this golden, beginning through the slow corruption of New Londo's rulers, the rise of the Darkwraiths, and the terrible choice that would ultimately seal the city's fate. We'll witness the flooding that transformed New Londo from a beacon of civilization into a watery tomb, and we'll follow the journey of the Chosen Undead as they descend into the abyss to face the fallen kings in their corrupted domain. Let yourself sink deeper into comfort now. Your breathing is slow and steady, your body is relaxed, and you're ready to drift through this tale of tragedy and transformation. The four kings await us in the depths, but we have time. All the time in the world. In the early days of the Age of Fire, when Lord Gwyn's light had cast away the ancient darkness and brought order to a world that had known only grey twilight, there existed a city that represented the very pinnacle of human achievement. New Londo stood as proof that mortals, when guided by wisdom and apparently blessed with divine favor, could create something truly magnificent. The city was built in relative proximity to Londo, the city of the gods. This geographical relationship suggests there may have been a close connection between the two cities, though the exact nature of that relationship can only be inferred from fragmentary evidence. The name, New Londo, itself implies it might have been consciously modeled after or associated with the divine city, representing humanity's aspiration to achieve something approaching the grandeur of the gods. Let your mind wander through the streets of New Londo at its height. The architecture here was something to behold, a perfect marriage of aesthetic beauty and practical function. Great towers rose toward the sky, their stonework so precisely fitted that not even a blade could slip between the blocks. Graceful bridges spanned the canals that ran through the city, their arches reflected in waters that ran clear and pure. The markets of New Londo bustled with activity from dawn until well after dusk. Merchants from distant lands brought exotic goods, spices from the swamps of Blighttown, fine fabrics from the royal city of Astora, weapons and armor forged in the workshops of Balder. The city had become a crossroads of culture and commerce, a place where different peoples could meet and trade in safety and mutual prosperity. But New Londo was more than just a center of commerce. It was a place of learning and culture, home to great libraries where scholars studied everything from the nature of souls to the movements of the stars. Artists flourished here, creating works of sculpture and painting that captured the essential vitality of the Age of Fire. Musicians composed pieces that would be remembered and performed for generations. The city's defenses were formidable, not because New Londo faced constant threats, but because its rulers understood that peace must be maintained through strength. The knights of New Londo were renowned throughout Lordran for their skill and discipline. They trained constantly, honing their abilities not for conquest, but for the protection of their home and people. At the heart of this prosperity stood the four kings, rulers who had earned their positions through qualities that Lord Gwyn himself recognized as exceptional. The exact details of who these four individuals were have been lost to time. Their names, their personalities, even the specific qualities that distinguished one from another. What we know comes from fragments. They were leaders of great foresight, wise enough to earn Lord Gwyn's trust and recognition. It's tempting to imagine what kind of men they might have been. Perhaps one excelled at strategy and long-term planning, seeing patterns others missed. Perhaps another understood human nature deeply, able to mediate disputes and create just laws. Maybe a third brought economic wisdom, understanding trade and prosperity. And possibly the fourth possessed knowledge of magic and the mysteries of the soul. But these are only reasonable suppositions based on what any great leader would need to govern effectively. The true individuals behind the title of Four Kings remain shadowy, their identities consumed by the very darkness they would eventually embrace. What is certain is that together, these rulers created something extraordinary. New Londo became more than just a successful city. It became, by all accounts, a model for what human civilization could achieve. Citizens enjoyed material prosperity, security, and opportunity. The city flourished under governance that was evidently both wise and effective. The people of New Londo loved their rulers not because they were forced to, but because they saw genuine wisdom and care in their leadership. The four kings walked among their citizens regularly, listening to concerns, celebrating successes, and maintaining a connection to the daily lives of those they governed. They were accessible yet respected, powerful yet humble. It was during this golden age that Lord Gwyn himself took notice of New Londo and its remarkable rulers. The Lord of Sunlight was impressed by what he saw, recognizing in the four kings a wisdom and capability that was rare even among the gods. He saw that these mortal rulers had created something special, a city that embodied the best ideals of the Age of Fire. In recognition of their exceptional leadership and foresight, Lord Gwyn made a decision that would forever alter the course of the Four Kings' destiny. He chose to grant them fragments of his own Lord Soul, one of the most powerful forces in existence. This was no small honor. Lord Souls were remnants of the first flame that had brought light and disparity to the world, and Gwyn's soul was among the mightiest of them all. By sharing portions of his soul with the Four Kings, Gwyn was doing more than simply granting them power. He was acknowledging them as near equals in the hierarchy of Lordran, elevating them to a status that few mortals had ever achieved. He was also binding them to his vision of order, tasking them with the responsibility of maintaining the Age of Fire and protecting their realm from the encroaching darkness. The Four Kings accepted this gift willingly and with full understanding of the burden it carried. They saw it as both an honor and a duty, a sacred trust that they would bear on behalf of their people. The fragments of Lord Soul enhanced their already considerable abilities, granting them insights and powers that exceeded even their previous remarkable capabilities. With their newfound power, the Four Kings transformed New Londo into something even more magnificent. The city's defenses became truly impregnable, protected not just by walls and warriors but by magical barriers that could turn aside any assault. The king's enhanced understanding of human souls allowed them to perceive the hopes, fears, and desires of their citizens with unprecedented clarity, making them even more effective rulers. They used their power wisely and well, always remembering that it had been granted to them not for their own aggrandizement but in trust for the betterment of their people. They established trade routes that connected distant lands, brought peace to warring regions, and created a network of alliances that strengthened the entire realm against external threats. The golden age of New Londo lasted for many years, each one seeming to bring new achievements and greater prosperity. The city became a beacon of hope and progress, its influence spreading throughout Lifedrain. Pilgrims traveled from distant lands to witness its marvels. Scholars came to study in its libraries. Warriors sought training from its masters. Yet even during these halcyon days, there were whispers of darker forces stirring. Deep beneath the city's foundations, in places where the stonework gave way to natural cavern and ancient rock, something was beginning to take notice of the light and prosperity above. The very success of New Londo, the concentration of power and wisdom in its rulers, had attracted attention from entities that dwelt in shadow. The four kings, confident in their abilities and secure in their power, paid little heed to these distant warnings. They had been blessed by Lord Gwyn himself. What could threaten them? They had transformed New Londo into something extraordinary. What could corrupt what they had built? This confidence, this assumption that their wisdom and power made them invulnerable, was perhaps the first seed of their eventual downfall. Pride is a subtle poison, working slowly and quietly, convincing the infected that they are immune to the very dangers they should fear most. But for now, in this golden age, all seemed well. The sun shone bright over New Londo, its people prospered, and the four kings ruled with wisdom and grace. The shadows had not yet begun to gather. The serpent had not yet arrived with his offers of forbidden knowledge. The fall, when it came, would be all the more devastating for the heights from which they would plummet. As you drift deeper into rest, hold this image of New Londo at its peak, a city of light and life, of wisdom and prosperity. Remember it well, for soon we will watch as it transforms into something very different. But for this moment, in this quiet space between waking and sleeping, let New Londo remain golden and pure, a dream of what could be when wisdom and power work in harmony. To understand the tragedy that would befall New Londo, we must first understand the men who ruled it. Though their names have been lost to history, consumed by the darkness they would embrace, their personalities and individual qualities shaped everything that followed. Each brought something unique to their shared governance, and each would fall in their own way. Let your breathing remain slow and steady as we explore who these rulers were before corruption claimed them. There's something deeply restful about character studies, about understanding the inner lives of those who shaped great events. Allow these portraits to form in your mind like paintings, emerging from darkness into candlelight. The first king was the strategist, the mind that saw patterns where others saw only chaos. In his youth, he had been a general, rising through the ranks not through noble birth, but through demonstrated brilliance in warfare and diplomacy. He understood that battles were won or lost long before armies met on the field, through careful positioning, reliable intelligence, and the cultivation of advantages that compounded over time. But he was not merely a military mind. His strategic thinking extended to all aspects of governance. He saw New Londo not as a static entity, but as something dynamic, constantly evolving in response to internal and external pressures. He understood how decisions made today would shape possibilities tomorrow, how small changes could cascade into major transformations. Those who knew him spoke of his remarkable memory, his ability to recall conversations from years past with perfect clarity, to track dozens of interlocking situations simultaneously, without losing sight of any thread. He would often spend long hours in silence, his eyes distant, as he worked through problems in the theater of his mind. Then he would emerge with solutions that seemed obvious in retrospect, but that no one else had seen. His weakness, if it could be called such, was a tendency toward abstraction. He sometimes viewed situations as puzzles to be solved rather than human dramas with real emotional stakes. This analytical distance served him well in many circumstances, allowing him to make difficult decisions without being paralyzed by sentiment. But it also meant he could miss the human cost of certain choices, seeing necessary sacrifices rather than individual tragedies. When Darkstalker Kaathe came with his offers of forbidden knowledge, It was this first king who would be most receptive to the intellectual challenge the serpent presented. The idea of hidden patterns in history, of secret knowledge that could unlock new strategic possibilities, appealed to his nature. He wanted to understand the full picture, to see all the pieces on the board, even those that had been deliberately concealed. The second king was the heart of their governance, the one who understood people not as abstractions but as living, breathing beings with needs, hopes, and fears. He had grown up among the common folk, the son of a merchant who had built a modest fortune through honest dealing and hard work. He never forgot his roots, never allowed power to distance him from the daily reality of ordinary lives. His gift was empathy, but not the passive kind that merely feels what others feel. His was an active empathy, one that sought to understand why people felt as they did, what needs drove their actions. He could look at a criminal and see not just the crime but the circumstances that had led to it. He could mediate between enemies and find the common ground they hadn't known existed. The laws he helped craft reflected this deep understanding of human nature. They were designed not merely to punish wrongdoing, but to prevent it by addressing underlying causes. They recognized that justice served best when it was tempered with mercy, when it sought to restore rather than simply to condemn. People loved him because they felt seen by him, understood in ways that went beyond surface appearances. He would walk the streets of New Londo regularly, stopping to talk with citizens from all walks of life. He knew the names of hundreds of people, remembered their children, asked about their struggles and celebrated their successes. His vulnerability lay in his very compassion. He hated to see suffering, sometimes to the point of being willing to accept questionable solutions if they promised to ease pain quickly. When Kaathe spoke of ways to better understand and connect with his people, of techniques that would allow him to literally feel what they felt, to know their inner selves completely, the temptation was profound. The third king was the pragmatist, the one who understood that even the noblest ideals required material resources to implement. He had built his reputation not through military prowess or philosophical wisdom, but through an uncanny ability to see value where others saw only cost, to recognize opportunities in situations that appeared to be problems. Under his guidance, New Londo's economy had flourished. He established trade agreements that benefited all parties, created systems of taxation that funded public works without crushing the people under their weight, and ensured that the city's prosperity was distributed widely enough to create a stable and content population. He understood that money was not an end in itself, but a tool, a means of making things happen. He invested in infrastructure, in education, in the support systems that allowed citizens to pursue their own paths to prosperity. He believed that a well-managed economy created the foundation upon which all other achievements rested. But his very practicality could sometimes lead him astray. He evaluated situations in terms of costs and benefits, of resources invested and returns received. This framework served well in many contexts but failed in others, particularly when dealing with matters that couldn't be reduced to economic calculations. When Kaathe offered knowledge that could increase New Londo's power and prosperity, the third king saw it as another opportunity to be evaluated. What would it cost? What would they gain? The serpent's promises seemed to offer tremendous returns on a relatively modest investment of moral flexibility. It was a deal that appeared to make sense from a purely practical standpoint. The fourth king was the scholar, the mystic, the one who sought to understand the fundamental nature of reality itself. He had devoted his life to the study of souls, to unraveling the mysteries of consciousness and existence. His research had led him deep into realms of knowledge that most people never even knew existed. He understood that souls were not simple things, but rather complex structures of memory, emotion, and identity held together by the mysterious force called humanity. He had studied how souls could be transferred, how they could be strengthened or weakened, how they responded to various magical and spiritual influences. His laboratory was filled with strange apparatus, devices for measuring and manipulating soul energy, for perceiving the invisible structures that underlay visible reality. He conducted his experiments with the rigor of a true scientist, carefully documenting every observation, forming hypotheses and testing them methodically. But his pursuit of knowledge had an obsessive quality to it. He was not content with surface understanding. He needed to know how things worked at the deepest possible level. This drive had made him an invaluable resource for New Londo, as his discoveries led to advances in magic and medicine that benefited the entire city. Yet this same obsessive curiosity made him vulnerable to temptation. When Kaathe revealed the existence of knowledge that had been deliberately hidden, secrets about the nature of the dark soul and humanity's true potential, the Fourth King's need to understand became overwhelming. How could he claim to be a true scholar if he deliberately turned away from knowledge, no matter how forbidden? Together, these four personalities created a balanced system of governance. The strategist provided long-term vision and tactical wisdom. The empath ensured that human needs and concerns remained central to all decisions. The economist created the material foundation for prosperity. The scholar pushed the boundaries of what was possible through innovation and discovery. But their very strengths would become doorways for corruption. The strategist's desire to see the full picture would make him receptive to Kaathe's revelations about hidden history. The empath's wish to better serve his people would make him vulnerable to promises of deeper connection. The economist's pragmatism would lead him to evaluate moral questions in terms of cost-benefit analysis. The scholar's hunger for knowledge would override his caution about the consequences of certain discoveries. Before their fall, they were remarkable men who had achieved something extraordinary. They had created a golden age, a city that stood as a testament to what humanity could accomplish. But they were still human, still subject to pride, ambition, and the subtle erosions of judgment that come from long success. As you drift deeper into rest, consider how even the wisest and most capable among us carry seeds of potential downfall, not because we are evil, but because our very strengths can become weaknesses when twisted by circumstances or exploited by those who understand our nature too well. The Four Kings were not villains from the beginning. They were heroes who would become cautionary tales. And that, perhaps, is what makes their stories so haunting, so worthy of remembering as we slip into sleep. They were not so different from us, these fallen rulers. Given power and faced with temptation, would we have chosen differently? Into the golden prosperity of New Londo came a being as ancient as the world itself, a creature that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless ages. Darkstalker Kaathe, one of the primordial serpents, slithered through the shadows beneath the city with purpose both dark and terrible. Let your body sink even deeper into comfort as we explore the nature of this tempter, this ancient being whose words would set in motion the fall of New Londo. There's something almost mythological about the serpent as a symbol of corruption, appearing in stories across cultures and ages. And in Dark Souls, Kaathe embodied this archetype perfectly. The primordial serpents were beings of immense age and cunning, entities that predated even the Age of Fire. They had witnessed the Age of Ancients, that grey and timeless epoch when everlasting dragons ruled in a world without disparity, without light or dark, life or death, heat or cold. They had seen the discovery of the first flame and the rise of the lords who claimed souls from its power. Kaathe and his counterpart, Kingseeker Frampt, represented two opposing philosophies about the nature of the world and how it should develop. Frampt served Lord Gwyn's vision of perpetuating the Age of Fire indefinitely, maintaining the current order regardless of the cost. Kaathe harbored different ambitions entirely. He sought to bring about the Age of Dark, to see humanity claim its rightful place as rulers of the world. He believed that Gwyn's Age of Fire was an artificial extension of what should have been a temporary epoch, that the natural cycle had been interrupted and needed to be restored, and for this restoration, he needed agents who possessed both power and authority, beings who could challenge the established order and lead others into darkness. The Four Kings of New Londo were perfect candidates for his purposes, blessed with fragments of a Lord soul and ruling over one of the greatest human civilizations in Lordran. They possessed exactly the combination of power and influence that Kaathe required, but he could not simply approach them directly with offers of corruption. These were wise men, capable rulers who had spent years building something good. They would reject obvious evil without hesitation. Instead, Kaathe employed patience and subtlety. He did not approach the four kings immediately upon his arrival beneath New Londo. Instead, he observed them from the shadows, studying their personalities, their desires, their weaknesses. He watched how they governed, noting patterns in their decision-making. He listened to their private conversations, learning their fears and ambitions. He discovered the strategist's hunger for complete understanding, his frustration at the gaps in his knowledge of history and the forces that shaped events. He perceived the empath's desire to serve his people more completely, his wish to understand them at a depth that went beyond ordinary human capacity. He recognized the economist's pragmatic approach to problem-solving, his tendency to evaluate options based on practical outcomes rather than abstract principles. He identified the scholar's obsessive need to understand, his inability to turn away from mystery, even when wisdom counseled restraint. Having identified these potential entry points, Kaathe crafted his approach carefully. When he finally revealed himself to the four kings, he did not appear as a tempter or corrupter. Instead, he presented himself as a teacher, a keeper of ancient wisdom who had come to share profound truths about the nature of existence. His initial words were not lies but carefully selected truths. He spoke of the age of ancients that had preceded the age of fire, describing a world that existed in perfect stasis, unchanging and eternal. He explained how the discovery of the first flame had brought disparity to this grey world, creating the distinctions between light and dark, life and death, heat and cold, that defined current reality. He revealed the existence of the Lord Souls discovered within the first flame, telling of how Gwyn claimed the soul of light, the Witch of Izalith took the soul of life, and Gravelord Nito seized the soul of death. And then he spoke of the fourth soul, the one often forgotten or deliberately obscured, the dark soul claimed by the furtive pygmy. This dark soul, Kaathe explained, was the birthright of all humanity. It was what made humans unique among the inhabitants of Lordran, granting them the capacity for growth, change, and potential that other beings lacked. But Gwyn, fearing the power of the dark soul and the potential of humanity, had worked to suppress this knowledge. The four kings listened with growing fascination as Kaathe wove his tale. The serpent's knowledge of ancient history was profound and accurate, lending credibility to his more controversial claims. He spoke of how Gwyn had branded humans with the dark sign, a curse designed to prevent them from fully accessing their dark heritage. He suggested that the Age of Fire had been established not out of benevolence, but out of fear of what humans might become if they embraced their true nature. This reframing of history was seductive because it explained certain inconsistencies that had troubled the four kings. Why were humans, despite their potential, always second to the gods in the hierarchy of Lordran? Why did certain knowledge seem deliberately obscured? Why did the Way of White and other religious institutions sometimes seem more concerned with maintaining order than pursuing truth? Kaathe did not rush them toward conclusions. He planted seeds of doubt and let them grow naturally. He raised questions rather than providing all the answers, allowing the four kings to feel as though they were arriving at profound truths through their own reasoning, rather than simply accepting the serpent's word. When he finally introduced the concept of Lifedrain, he did so not as forbidden magic but as humanity's natural ability, suppressed by the false morality of the gods. He explained that humans, as inheritors of the dark soul, had the innate capacity to draw upon the humanity of others, to absorb their life force and add it to their own power. This was not evil, he claimed, but simply the natural order that had been artificially constrained. He framed Lifedrain as a return to authenticity, a casting off of the limitations imposed by divine authority. How could the four kings truly serve their people if they limited themselves to only the knowledge and abilities that Gwyn deemed acceptable? Didn't they owe it to their citizens to explore every avenue of power that might benefit their realm? The arguments were seductive precisely because they contained elements of truth. The four kings could sense sincerity in Kaathe's words, the genuine belief that he was offering them a path to greater wisdom and power. His knowledge of ancient history was accurate, making his interpretations seem credible even when they were twisted to serve his agenda. Most importantly, Kaathe's offers seemed to align with the four kings' own noble goals. The strategist saw an opportunity to understand the full scope of forces shaping history, The empath envisioned deeper connections with his people. The economist perceived practical benefits from new sources of power. The scholar recognized the promise of forbidden knowledge, mysteries that had been kept hidden for reasons that now seemed suspect. The corruption began with small steps, minor applications of the knowledge Kaathe provided. Perhaps they could use a touch of Lifedrain to heal a dying subject, drawing death from them and replacing it with vitality. Or they might employ these techniques to better understand the nature of the human souls under their care. Each small step seemed reasonable, justified by good intentions. Kaathe watched these first experiments with satisfaction. The four kings were taking the bait exactly as he had anticipated. They told themselves they were merely expanding their understanding, exploring new methods of rulership that could benefit their people. They maintained their roles as benevolent leaders while secretly delving deeper into the mysteries the serpent revealed. But darkness has a way of spreading, of taking root in the soul, and growing beyond its intended bounds. What began as academic curiosity and careful experimentation would evolve into something far more sinister. The more the four kings experimented with Lifedrain, the more they began to crave its power. The absorption of human souls was intoxicating in ways they had never imagined. Each soul they absorbed brought with it memories, experiences, and emotions that enriched their own existence. They began to understand their subjects in ways that went far beyond their previous empathetic leadership. They could literally feel what their people felt, know what they knew, experience their joys and sorrows as if they were their own. This intimate connection with their subjects' souls gradually shifted their perspective on rulership. Why settle for guiding and protecting their people when they could become one with them? Why limit themselves to external leadership when they could incorporate their subjects' very essence into their own being? Kaathe observed these developments with patient satisfaction. The four kings were transforming exactly as he had hoped, evolving from benevolent rulers into something far more useful for his purposes. Soon they would be ready for the final stage of corruption, the complete embrace of the abyss that would make them perfect servants of the Age of Dark. The serpent's ultimate goal was not merely to corrupt four mortal rulers, but to establish a foothold for the abyss in the world above. The four kings, blessed with fragments of a Lord's soul and commanding a major human civilization, were ideal conduits for this purpose. Through them, the primordial darkness could begin to seep into the Age of Fire itself, preparing the way for its eventual replacement by the Age of Dark. As you drift deeper into rest, consider the nature of corruption. It rarely announces itself as evil. Instead, it comes wrapped in reasonable arguments, appealing to our better natures and our genuine desires to do good. Kaathe did not need to make the four kings evil. He only needed to convince them that certain actions were justified, that certain knowledge was necessary, that certain powers were rightfully theirs. The tragedy of New Londo did not begin with a conscious choice to embrace darkness. It began with wise men making what seemed like reasonable decisions, each one justifiable on its own, each one leading almost imperceptibly toward the abyss. The transformation of the four kings from noble rulers to servants of darkness was not a sudden event but a gradual process, like a slow poison working its way through a body. Let your breathing remain deep, and even as we trace this descent, watching how each small compromise led inexorably to the next. The art of Lifedrain, as taught by Darkstalker Kaathe, was not simply a technique for stealing life force. It was a fundamental reordering of how one related to other beings, a shift from seeing people as separate entities to viewing them as potential sources of power and understanding. This shift in perspective was perhaps the most insidious aspect of the corruption. The four kings' initial experiments with Lifedrain were conducted with scientific rigor and ethical caution. They began by practicing on criminals condemned to death, reasoning that if these individuals were going to die anyway, using them to explore new magical techniques served a useful purpose. They took meticulous notes, documenting the sensations and experiences that came with absorbing another being's humanity. What they discovered was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. When they drew humanity from another person, they didn't just gain power, they gained pieces of that person's lived experience. Memories flooded into their consciousness, not as abstract information but as lived reality. They felt emotions that weren't originally theirs. They understood perspectives they had never held. The scholar among them was particularly fascinated by this phenomenon. He saw it as a form of direct knowledge transfer far superior to any educational method. Why spend years studying a subject when you could simply absorb the expertise of a master? Why rely on second-hand accounts of experiences when you could possess those experiences directly? The empath found himself able to understand his subjects with unprecedented depth. He could literally feel what they felt, know their joys and sufferings as intimately as his own. At first, this seemed like the ultimate expression of compassionate governance. How could he fail to serve people well when he understood them so completely? But there was a problem that they initially failed to recognize. The process was fundamentally predatory. Lifedrain required taking something essential from another being, diminishing them to enhance yourself. No matter how carefully they tried to control and limit the practice, its fundamental nature was parasitic. The strategist noticed troubling patterns in their behavior. After several months of experimentation, they were becoming more secretive, conducting their research in hidden chambers rather than in the light of day. They were rationalizing increasingly questionable choices, finding reasons why it was necessary to practice on subjects who weren't criminals, who hadn't been condemned to death. He raised his concerns at one of their private councils, suggesting that perhaps they should pause their research and reflect on where it was leading them. But the others dismissed his worries. They pointed to the benefits they had already gained, their enhanced abilities as rulers, their deeper understanding of their subjects, their growing power to protect and serve their city. The Economist framed it in terms of cost-benefit analysis. Yes, there were risks, but the potential rewards were substantial. They needed to be smart about how they proceeded, certainly, but abandoning this research entirely would mean giving up advantages that could prove crucial to New Londo's future security and prosperity. The scholar argued from a position of intellectual integrity. How could they claim to be seekers of truth if they deliberately turned away from knowledge simply because it made them uncomfortable? Wasn't that exactly the kind of willful ignorance that Kaathe had accused the gods of promoting? And so they continued, each experiment pushing the boundaries a little further, each application of Lifedrain becoming a little easier to justify. They told themselves they were maintaining control, that they were using these techniques responsibly for the greater good. But the truth was that the techniques were using them, reshaping their understanding of morality and their relationship to other beings. The physical transformation began subtly. Their skin took on a grayish tinge, barely noticeable at first, but gradually becoming more pronounced. Around their hearts, where the fragments of Lord's soul resided, bark-like growths began to appear, as if their bodies were trying to contain or adapt to the conflicting energies of divine light and abyssal darkness. These physical changes were accompanied by psychological shifts even more profound. The four kings began to experience strange dreams, visions of a world consumed by darkness where humanity ruled supreme and the artificial light of the gods had been extinguished. These dreams didn't feel like nightmares. They felt like revelations, glimpses of a future that was both inevitable and desirable. Their perception of their subjects began to change in subtle but significant ways. Where once they had seen individuals with unique personalities and inherent worth, they increasingly saw vessels of humanity, potential sources of power to be tapped. They still cared about their people, but in the way a farmer might care about livestock as resources, to be managed and utilized, rather than as equals to be respected. Kaathe continued to visit them regularly, always bringing new knowledge, new techniques, new justifications for their expanding use of Lifedrain. He taught them how to drain souls from a distance, how to target specific aspects of a person's being, how to store absorbed humanity for later use. Each lesson came with philosophical frameworks that made the practice seem not just acceptable but righteous. The serpent spoke eloquently about humanity's stolen birthright, about the tyranny of the gods who had placed themselves above mortals through force and deception. He painted Lord Gwyn not as a benevolent protector, but as a fearful tyrant who had recognized the threat that humanity posed to his dominance and had worked systematically to keep mortals subservient. According to Kaathe's teachings, the four kings weren't betraying their people by practicing Lifedrain. They were preparing the way for humanity's liberation from divine oppression. Every soul they absorbed brought them closer to the power they would need to challenge the established order. Every experiment brought them deeper understanding of humanity's true potential. The strategist found himself drawn to Kaathe's vision of the future. He saw the potential for a complete reorganization of Lordaeron's power structure, with humanity ascending to its rightful place, and the Age of Dark bringing about a new order that would be more just and more natural than the artificial Age of Fire. It was a long-term strategy that appealed to his nature as a planner and visionary. The empath rationalized his increasing use of Lifedrain as a form of ultimate communion with his people. By absorbing their humanity, he was taking them into himself, making them part of something greater. There was a twisted logic to it that made sense to his corrupted reasoning. If he contained the souls of his subjects within himself, then serving his own interests became identical to serving theirs. The economist calculated that the power gained from Lifedrain far exceeded any moral cost. In purely practical terms, the technique gave them capabilities that would have taken decades or centuries to develop through conventional means. The efficiency was undeniable, and in his cost-benefit framework, efficiency was the highest good. The scholar had perhaps fallen deepest into corruption, driven by his insatiable need to understand. He had moved beyond merely studying Lifedrain to experimenting with variations and refinements of the technique. He kept detailed records of every soul he absorbed, cataloging the knowledge and abilities he gained, searching for patterns that might unlock even greater secrets. Together, they began to share their knowledge with their most trusted knights, creating the first Darkwraiths. These warriors, selected for their loyalty and skill, were inducted into the mysteries of Lifedrain through careful instruction and gradual exposure to the Abyss's influence. The four kings framed this as an honor, a sharing of sacred knowledge with the most worthy of their subjects. The knights accepted the gift eagerly, seeing it as recognition of their exceptional service. They couldn't understand that they were being transformed into weapons, tools for harvesting human souls on a scale that would have been impossible for the four kings alone to achieve. The creation of the Darkwraith Order marked a turning point, the moment when corruption moved from private vice to institutional policy. The Darkwraiths were given orders to travel throughout Lordaeron, ostensibly on diplomatic or military missions, but with a secret mandate to harvest souls wherever they went. They were taught to identify individuals with strong humanity, to infiltrate communities and gain trust before striking. They became, in effect, an army of soul predators operating under the cover of New Londo's legitimate authority. As their power grew and their connection to the Abyss deepened, the four kings began to lose touch with their original selves. The memories of who they had been, wise rulers dedicated to serving their people, began to feel distant and unreal, like stories they had heard about strangers. They retained enough of their intelligence and personality to function as leaders, but their motivations had been fundamentally transformed. They still made decisions about New Londo's governance, still issued proclamations and held court, but these actions were now undertaken in service to different goals. They were no longer building a prosperous city for its own sake. They were creating infrastructure to support their growing hunger for souls. They weren't protecting their people. They were managing a resource to be harvested. The city itself began to change in response to its rulers' corruption. The atmosphere grew heavier, more oppressive. Citizens reported feeling watched, as if eyes followed them even in their private moments. The shadows seemed to deepen and linger even in bright sunlight. Animals became nervous and skittish, fleeing the city in numbers that couldn't be explained by natural causes. Some of the more sensitive inhabitants began to have disturbing dreams similar to those experienced by the four kings. They saw visions of darkness rising from beneath the city, of their rulers transformed into something monstrous, of New Londo consumed by shadows. Most dismissed these dreams as meaningless nightmares, but a few tried to flee the city, only to find that the four kings had begun restricting movement across New Londo's borders. The official explanation was security concerns, threats from hostile forces that required tighter control over who entered and left the city. But the truth was that the four kings were growing paranoid about preserving the secrecy of their transformation. Anyone who knew too much, who had seen too much, became a liability to be eliminated or, more often, a source of souls to be harvested. The corruption had reached a critical threshold. What had begun as careful experimentation with forbidden knowledge had evolved into systematic predation on the very people the four kings had sworn to protect. and yet they seemed unable to recognize what they had become, their corrupted reasoning providing endless justifications for actions that would have horrified their former selves. Beneath the city, in the deepest reaches where foundation met bedrock, something was stirring. The abyss, drawn by the concentration of dark energy, by the practice of Lifedrain on such a scale, was beginning to manifest in the physical world. The primordial darkness that had existed before the Age of Fire was seeping upward through cracks in reality, called forth by the Four Kings' corruption like a beacon in the night. As you sink deeper into rest, your body heavy and relaxed, consider how corruption works not through dramatic transformation, but through incremental change. Each step seems small enough to justify, each compromise feels temporary and necessary, but the direction remains constant, always downward, always darker, until those who have traveled this path can no longer recognize how far they've fallen. The Four Kings didn't wake up one morning and decide to become monsters. They remained convinced throughout their transformation that they were serving a greater good, pursuing necessary knowledge, doing what had to be done for the sake of their people. And perhaps that is the most terrifying aspect of their tale, the ease with which noble intentions can be twisted to serve the darkest purposes. The transformation of New Londo's finest knights into Darkwraiths represents one of the most tragic chapters in the city's fall. These warriors had once been paragons of virtue, dedicated to protecting the innocent and upholding justice. Now they would become instruments of predation, spreading the Four Kings of corruption throughout Lifedrain. Let your mind drift through this next phase of the story, your breathing slow and rhythmic. There's a dreamlike quality to the way corruption spreads, how it transforms everything it touches, yet somehow makes each change feel inevitable, even necessary. The process of creating a Darkwraith was both physical and spiritual, requiring the complete corruption of a warrior's soul. It began with selection. The Four Kings identified their most loyal and capable knights, those whose dedication to New Londo was absolute, and whose combat skills were exceptional. These were not weak-willed individuals who could be easily manipulated. They were the best of the best, which made their fall all the more significant. The chosen knights were brought to secret chambers deep beneath the city, where the influence of the abyss was strongest. There, the Four Kings personally instructed them in the art of Lifedrain, framing it as an advanced combat technique that would allow them to better serve their city and their rulers. The lessons were gradual, carefully structured to overcome natural resistance and moral qualms. The first applications seemed innocent enough. Knights were taught to draw upon the life force of fallen enemies to heal their own wounds, a practical technique that could mean the difference between survival and death in combat. This initial use created a precedent, establishing Lifedrain as a legitimate tool rather than a forbidden practice. From there, the instruction became progressively darker. Knights learned to use Lifedrain proactively rather than just reactively, to weaken opponents before delivering killing blows. They practiced on prisoners, on criminals, on those deemed enemies of New Londo. Each application made the next easier, dulling the conscience through repetition and rationalization. The physical transformation of the knights mirrored that of their masters. Their armor, once bright and polished, began to darken as if stained by shadow itself. The metal took on properties that couldn't be explained by normal metallurgy, becoming harder and more resistant to damage but also somehow wrong, as if it had been infused with the essence of the abyss. Their weapons underwent similar changes. Swords and spears that had been forged through normal methods became conduits for dark energy, capable of draining life force with each strike. But the signature weapon of the Darkwraiths became the Dark Hand, a gauntlet-like device that allowed its wielder to reach directly into an opponent's chest and tear out their humanity. The Dark Hand was both practical and symbolic. It represented the complete rejection of the Darkwraiths' former role as protectors, transforming hands that had once shielded the innocent into weapons for stealing the very essence of life. The ability to directly extract humanity made Darkwraiths far more efficient at their grim work, allowing them to harvest souls quickly and thoroughly. The psychological transformation was perhaps even more disturbing than the physical changes. Warriors who had once been motivated by honor, duty, and compassion found themselves driven by an insatiable hunger for human souls. They began to view other people not as individuals to be protected, but as prey to be harvested. Yet they retained their intelligence and tactical acumen, making them far more dangerous than mindless monsters. A Darkwraith could infiltrate a community, gain trust, identify the most valuable targets, and then strike with surgical precision. They operated with the discipline and coordination of elite military units, but in service to predation rather than protection. The four kings organized the Darkwraiths into a covenant, a sacred order bound together by shared purpose and mutual dependence. This covenant created a metaphysical connection, linking all Darkwraiths to each other and to their masters, allowing for coordination across vast distances and the sharing of harvested souls among members of the order. Through this covenant bond, the four kings could direct their servants' actions with precision. They could perceive through the Darkwraith's eyes, guide their tactics in real time, and ensure that harvested souls were efficiently distributed to maximize the order's overall power. The Darkwraiths became extensions of the four kings' will, components of a larger organism dedicated to the spread of corruption. The Darkwraiths' missions took them far beyond New Londo's borders. They traveled to distant cities and remote villages, always wearing the guise of legitimate representatives of their city. They might pose as merchants, diplomats, mercenaries, or scholars, whatever role would grant them access to populations of strong souls. Their hunting techniques became increasingly sophisticated over time. They learned to sense the strength of a person's humanity from great distances, allowing them to track particularly valuable targets across vast expanses of terrain. They developed methods for identifying individuals whose souls would provide maximum benefit, seeking out mages, warriors, priests, and other wielders of spiritual power. Some Darkwraiths specialized in mass harvesting operations, targeting densely populated areas where they could gather many souls quickly. They might infiltrate a festival or religious gathering, using the crowd's festive mood and lowered vigilance to their advantage. Others preferred to focus on high-value individual targets, spending weeks or months studying a particular victim before making their move. The most skilled Darkwraiths could drain a soul so subtly that the victim might not even realize what was happening until it was too late. They would pose as healers or spiritual advisors, gradually siphoning humanity during what appeared to be legitimate treatments or counseling sessions. By the time the victim recognized something was wrong, they had already lost too much to resist effectively. The Covenant also served as a recruitment mechanism. Darkwraiths sought out individuals who might be susceptible to corruption and added them to their ranks. They looked for people who were already angry, desperate, or morally compromised, those who might be willing to embrace the dark arts in exchange for power or revenge. Ambitious nobles who craved greater influence, fallen knights seeking redemption through power rather than virtue, desperate criminals looking for any advantage, all proved to be fertile ground for recruitment. The Darkwraiths offered them a path to significance, a sense of belonging to something greater than themselves, and abilities that exceeded anything they could achieve through legitimate means. As their numbers grew and their techniques became more refined, the Darkwraiths began to have a noticeable impact on the broader political and social landscape of Lordran. Cities that had once been prosperous and secure began to experience unexplained declines in morale and productivity. Trade routes became dangerous as travelers disappeared without explanation. The very fabric of civilization began to fray as the corrupted knights spread their influence across the realm. The economic impact was particularly severe in regions where Darkwraiths operated extensively. The loss of skilled workers, merchants, and craftsmen to soul harvesting created labor shortages and disrupted supply chains. Communities that lost too many members to the Darkwraiths often collapsed entirely, unable to maintain the population levels necessary for sustainable civilization. The psychological impact on survivors was profound. People who had witnessed Darkwraith attacks, or who had lost loved ones to their predations, developed a deep-seated fear that poisoned social relationships. Trust broke down as communities became suspicious of outsiders, and even of their own members. The social cohesion that had characterized the Age of Fire's best years eroded under the constant threat of invisible predators. Religious institutions struggled to explain the phenomenon. Priests and priestesses tried to provide comfort and guidance to those affected by Darkwraith attacks, but their explanations often fell short. How could benevolent gods allow such evil to flourish? Why weren't the defenders of the light more effective at stopping this corruption? Some clergy began to question the fundamental narratives they had been taught about the Age of Fire and the nature of the gods. If Gwyn and his allied deities were truly all-powerful and benevolent, why did they permit the four kings to fall and the Darkwraiths to spread? These doubts weakened the spiritual foundation that had supported the Age of Fire, adding to the general sense of decline and approaching darkness. Military forces throughout Lifedrain attempted to combat the Darkwraith threat, but conventional tactics proved largely ineffective. Darkwraiths were exceptional warriors enhanced by dark magic and the stolen strength of countless victims. They could move through shadows, appear suddenly in unexpected locations, and drain the life from opponents before effective resistance could be organized. More problematic still was the difficulty in identifying Darkwraiths before they struck. They didn't wear their corruption openly, but instead concealed it beneath legitimate guises. By the time their true nature was revealed, they had often already accomplished their mission and escaped. Tracking them back to New Londo proved nearly impossible, as they were skilled at covering their trails and eliminating witnesses. The four kings watched the spread of their Darkwraith covenant with satisfaction, seeing it as proof of their growing power and the inevitable triumph of their dark vision. They had created an army of soul harvesters that operated independently while remaining bound to their will. The covenant had become self-sustaining, recruiting new members and expanding its operations without requiring constant direct oversight. But the very success of the Darkwraiths would ultimately contribute to the four kings' downfall. Their activities were too widespread and too destructive to remain hidden indefinitely. As reports of mysterious disappearances and soul thefts reached Londo, Lord Gwyn and his advisors began to investigate. The scale of the corruption became apparent, and the magnitude of the threat could no longer be ignored. The Darkwraiths had served their masters well, spreading corruption throughout Lifedrain and harvesting countless souls to fuel the four kings' growing power. But in doing so, they had also drawn the attention of forces far greater than anything they had previously encountered. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of New Londo, but the future of the entire Age of Fire. As you drift deeper into rest, your body completely relaxed, your mind quiet and peaceful, reflect on how corruption spreads, not just through individual choices, but through institutions and organizations. The Darkwraiths were created by the four kings, but they took on a life of their own, perpetuating and amplifying the corruption that spawned them. Evil, once institutionalized, becomes self-sustaining, feeding on itself, and growing beyond the control of even those who created it. Beneath the foundations of New Londo, in depths that predated the Age of Fire itself, something ancient and terrible began to stir. The abyss, that primordial darkness from which all things had emerged before the coming of the first flame, had felt the call of the corruption spreading through the city above. Let your breathing remain deep and steady as we descend into these darkest depths. There's something almost meditative about confronting absolute darkness, about acknowledging the void that exists beneath all structure and meaning. Allow yourself to sink into this exploration of the fundamental forces that shape existence. The abyss was not merely darkness in the sense of an absence of light. It was something far more fundamental and terrifying, the embodiment of entropy itself, the force that sought to return all things to the undifferentiated void from which they had originally emerged. Before the Age of Ancients, before even the grey timeless epoch of the everlasting dragons, there had been only the abyss. When the first flame appeared, it brought disparity to the world, light and dark, life and death, heat and cold. This disparity created the structure and meaning that defined existence as mortals understood it. But the abyss remained beneath everything, patient and eternal, waiting for opportunities to reassert itself and undo the artificial order that the flame had created. The corruption of the four kings provided exactly such an opportunity. Their experiments with Lifedrain, their growing connection to dark forces, and their increasingly predatory relationship with human souls created a kind of resonance with the deepest darkness. Like called to like, and the abyss began to rise from its eternal slumber, drawn toward these new conduits through which it could influence the world above. The first signs of the abyss's awakening were subtle. noticed only by the most sensitive inhabitants of New Londo. Shadows began to behave strangely, moving independently of the objects that cast them and lingering in places where no shadows should exist. These weren't mere optical illusions, but actual manifestations of the abyss beginning to seep into physical reality. Temperatures dropped in certain areas of the city for no apparent reason, creating pockets of unnatural cold that seemed to emanate from the stones themselves. People who lingered in these cold zones reported feeling drained, as if something invisible was slowly siphoning away their vitality. Animals became agitated and fearful, their instincts warning them of danger that human senses couldn't yet perceive. The city's architecture began to change in response to the abyss's influence. Stone that had stood firm for centuries started to develop cracks and fissures, not from age or structural weakness, but from some internal corruption that seemed to eat away at the material itself. The very foundations of buildings began to shift and settle as the ground beneath them was hollowed out by the spreading darkness below. Water sources throughout the city became tainted with an oily substance that defied identification. Wells that had provided clear water for generations now yielded liquid that was dark and viscous, carrying with it the taste of despair and the smell of decay. The city's fountains, once sources of beauty and refreshment, became stagnant pools where nothing living could survive for long. The abyss's influence manifested most strongly in the deepest parts of New Londo, particularly in the sewers and underground chambers that honeycombed the city's foundations. These areas became breeding grounds for creatures that had never before been seen in the world above, beings of pure darkness that emerged from the depths, formless entities that fed on light and hope. These abyssal manifestations were drawn to sources of humanity like moths to flame. They could sense the life force of the city's inhabitants from great distances, and they moved through the darkness with predatory intent. Unlike the Darkwraiths, who retained their human intelligence and could be reasoned with, these creatures of the abyss were driven by pure instinct, existing only to consume and drain away light and life from everything they encountered. The four kings initially welcomed these developments, interpreting them as signs of their growing connection to what they believed were fundamental forces they could harness. They may have thought they could control and direct these manifestations of the abyss, just as they commanded their Darkwraith servants, an assumption that would prove to be tragically misguided. The abyss, by its very nature, served no master and acknowledged no authority save its own inexorable pull toward entropy. It was not a tool to be wielded, but a force to be respected or feared. The four kings had opened a door that they lacked the power to close, inviting into their realm something that cared nothing for their ambitions or their original noble intentions. As the corruption deepened, the very nature of space and time within New Londo began to warp and distort. Certain areas of the city became maze-like, with corridors that led nowhere and rooms that existed in impossible configurations. Visitors to these affected areas reported becoming lost for hours or even days in passages they had walked countless times before. Some who ventured into the most corrupted sections never returned at all, vanishing into pockets of reality that had been consumed by the encroaching darkness. These disappearances created growing fear among the population, though most citizens still didn't understand the true nature of the threat they faced. The abyss's influence extended beyond the physical realm, affecting the spiritual and psychological state of everyone within its reach. Citizens of New Londo began to experience shared nightmares, visions of a world consumed by darkness where all light had been extinguished. These dreams were not random fantasies, but prophetic glimpses of the future that the abyss sought to create. The psychological pressure of these constant visions of doom began to break down the social fabric of the city. Trust eroded as neighbors grew suspicious of one another. Paranoia spread as people imagined corruption lurking behind every familiar face. The bonds of community that had once held New Londo together began to unravel under the weight of collective fear and despair. Perhaps most disturbing of all were the changes that began to occur in children born after the corruption began. These young people showed signs of being touched by the abyss from birth. Their eyes were darker than normal, their shadows moved independently, and they seemed to understand things that no child should know. They would sometimes speak in languages that predated human civilization, uttering words that carried the weight of ancient darkness. These children became living conduits for the abyss's influence, spreading its corruption simply through their presence. Parents watched in horror as their offspring transformed into something alien, retaining the appearance of humanity, but operating according to principles that no mortal mind could fully grasp. The four kings themselves underwent profound transformations in response to the abyss's awakening. Their physical forms continued to mutate, the bark-like growths that had begun around their hearts spreading across their entire bodies, creating natural armor that was stronger than steel but cold to the touch. Their limbs elongated and twisted, becoming more suited to their new existence as beings of darkness than to their former roles as human rulers. More significantly, their minds began to operate on fundamentally different principles. The wisdom and compassion that had once defined their leadership were replaced by an alien intelligence that viewed the world through the lens of entropy and consumption. They retained memories of their former selves, but these recollections seemed to belong to different people entirely, creatures whose motivations and desires they could no longer understand or relate to. The fragments of Lord's soul within the four kings became focal points for the abyss's power, transforming from sources of divine light into conduits for primordial darkness. This transformation was not without conflict, as the fundamental nature of these soul fragments resisted corruption. The resulting internal struggle manifested as periods of intense pain and disorientation, during which the kings experienced visions of both their glorious past and their inevitable future as servants of the abyss. The city's lower levels were gradually consumed by darkness, becoming part of the abyss itself rather than remaining in the world of light and form. Buildings that had stood for centuries sank into the ground as the foundations beneath them dissolved into void. Streets that had once connected different districts now led into absolute darkness from which travelers did not return. The four kings made their final transformation during this period, abandoning any pretense of human form to become creatures of pure darkness. They descended into the deepest parts of the city, taking up residence in the heart of the abyss itself. From this position, they could oversee the final stages of their realm's corruption, while enjoying direct communion with the primordial darkness that had become their true master. Their throne room, which had once been a place of wisdom and just governance, transformed into something that existed simultaneously in the physical world and in the realm of pure darkness. Visitors who approached this space reported feeling reality itself grow thin, as if they were standing at the edge of existence looking into the void from which all things emerged and to which all things would eventually return. The awakening of the abyss marked the point of no return for New Londo. What had begun as a noble experiment in enhanced governance had become an existential threat not just to the city itself, but to the entire Age of Fire. The corruption that had started with the four kings' acceptance of Kaathe's teachings now threatened to spread across all of Lordran, consuming everything in its path and returning the world to the undifferentiated darkness from which it had originally emerged. But the forces of light were not blind to what was happening. As the abyss awakened and its influence began to spread beyond New Londo's borders, it attracted the attention of powers that were both willing and able to resist its advance. In the halls of Anor Londo, Lord Gwyn and his advisors were beginning to understand the magnitude of the threat, and they were preparing to take action. As you sink even deeper into rest, completely relaxed and at peace, contemplate the nature of the abyss. It is not evil in any moral sense. It simply is an eternal force that predates concepts like good and evil, right and wrong. It seeks only to return things to their original state of undifferentiated nothingness, to undo the disparity and structure that the first flame created. In its own way, the abyss is as natural as gravity, as inevitable as entropy. And perhaps that is what makes it so terrifying. In the shining halls of Anor Londo, far above the growing darkness that consumed New Londo, Lord Gwyn observed the corruption of his former vassals with mounting alarm. The four kings, whom he had trusted with fragments of his own Lord's soul, had betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible. They had embraced the very darkness that the Age of Fire had been established to hold at bay. Let your breathing remain slow and steady as we turn our attention to one of Dark Soul's most legendary figures. There's something deeply compelling about heroes who face impossible odds, who fight valiantly even when victory seems impossible. Allow yourself to drift through this story of courage and tragedy. Among Gwyn's 4 knights, one stood out as uniquely qualified to face the threat posed by the 4 kings and their abyss-corrupted domain. Knight Artorias, known throughout Lifedrain as the Abyss Walker, had already demonstrated remarkable capabilities in dealing with creatures of the abyss. His reputation as a hunter of dark, corrupted beings made him an ideal choice to investigate the spreading corruption from New Londo. Artorias was a figure of legend even before his connection to the New Londo crisis. Tall and powerful, clad in distinctive armor adorned with a blue cape that marked him as one of Gwyn's chosen, he embodied the martial ideals of the Lord of Sunlight's finest knights. His skill with a greatsword was unmatched, and his unwavering dedication to the cause of light had earned him the respect and admiration of all who served under Gwyn's banner. What distinguished Artorias was his unique ability related to traversing the abyss, through means that remained somewhat mysterious, whether through a covenant with certain beings or through special equipment and blessings. He had developed the capability to enter areas tainted by the abyss, without immediately succumbing to its corrupting influence. This gave him his title, Artorias the Abyss Walker. When Gwyn recognized the severity of the threat posed by the 4 kings and their Darkwraith servants, Artorias was the natural choice to address it. The knight accepted this responsibility without hesitation, understanding the magnitude of the danger and what failure might mean for all of Lifedrain. Artorias was not to undertake this mission alone. His constant companion, the great grey wolf Sif, accompanied him as always. This magnificent creature, larger and more intelligent than any ordinary wolf, had formed an unbreakable bond with the knight. Sif's keen senses and natural resistance to certain dark influences made the wolf an invaluable ally. The knight also prepared himself with artifacts designed to combat the influence of the abyss. Based on item descriptions and lore, he carried the silver pendant, described as an ancient treasure of Londo that could deflect the dark of the abyss, especially in its magical forms. This pendant would provide crucial protection against abyssal attacks. Artorias' campaign took him to New Londo, where he worked to combat the Darkwraiths and investigate the corruption spreading from the city. The details of exactly what transpired during his time in New Londo are fragmentary. What we know comes from piecing together various sources and implications from the broader lore. What seems clear is that Artorias discovered or developed the ability to traverse the abyss itself during his time dealing with the New Londo crisis. This capability, whether through a ring that would later be called the Covenant of Artorias or through other means, allowed him to enter the deepest darkness without immediately perishing. The campaign against the Darkwraiths would have been grueling. These corrupted knights, once noble warriors of New Londo, had become formidable opponents, enhanced by dark powers and the art of Lifedrain. Artorias fought them throughout the lands surrounding New Londo, disrupting their operations and preventing the spread of their corruption. However, based on what we know from the broader lore, Artorias' ultimate mission in New Londo, if it involved a direct confrontation with the 4 kings themselves, did not end in clear victory. The knight would later face an even greater test in Ulasile, where he would ultimately fall to the abyss, while trying to save Princess Dusk and stop Manus, father of the abyss. His failure in Ulasile, rather than in New Londo specifically, demonstrated that even the greatest warrior of the age had limits when facing the primordial darkness. This realization must have weighed heavily on Lord Gwyn and his advisors as they contemplated what to do about the 4 kings and their corrupted city. The lesson from Artorias' struggles was clear. Conventional heroism, no matter how exceptional, might not be sufficient to contain the threat posed by the abyss's manifestation in New Londo. If even Artorias, with all his specialized abilities and equipment, could eventually fall to the darkness, then more drastic measures might be necessary. As you drift deeper into sleep, your body completely at rest, consider the tragedy of even the greatest heroes reaching their limits. Artorias was perhaps the finest warrior of his age, dedicated to the cause of light and equipped with every advantage. Yet even he would ultimately fall when facing forces beyond mortal comprehension. His struggles in dealing with abyss-corrupted threats helped demonstrate that some problems cannot be solved through individual valor alone, no matter how legendary the hero. In the halls of Londo, Lord Gwyn, convened his most trusted advisors to discuss the crisis that threatened to consume all of Lordran. The corruption spreading from New Londo had progressed beyond the point where conventional measures could contain it. The abyss was awakening, and with it came the potential for catastrophe on an unimaginable scale. Let your breathing remain deep and rhythmic as we explore one of the most morally complex decisions in the history of the Age of Fire. There's something profoundly unsettling about impossible choices, about situations where every option leads to tragedy. Yet there's also something strangely peaceful about accepting that some decisions have no good outcomes, only lesser evils. The reports from Artorias' reconnaissance missions painted a dire picture. The Four Kings had progressed far beyond simple corruption. They had become conduits for forces that threatened the very existence of the Age of Fire. The abyss flowing through them was not just another enemy to be defeated in battle, but a fundamental force of entropy that sought to return the world to the undifferentiated void from which it had originally emerged. If allowed to continue spreading, the corruption would eventually consume all of Lordran and bring about the premature end of the Age of Light and Disparity. Villages in the vicinity of New Londo were already reporting strange phenomena. Livestock drained of life, wells producing water black as night, children speaking in ancient tongues. The infection was spreading, and every day of delay allowed it to claim new territory. The assembled council debated long into the night, considering every possible solution. Some suggested a massive military assault, combining the forces of all the loyal kingdoms to overwhelm New Londo through sheer numbers. Others advocated for magical solutions, using powerful sorceries to create barriers that would contain the corruption while specialists worked to find a cure. A few optimistic voices even suggested that the Four Kings might still be redeemed, that their corruption could be reversed if the right combination of divine intervention and magical treatment could be brought to bear. Perhaps they could be rescued from the abyss's influence and restored to their former nobility. But as the debate continued, it became increasingly clear that none of these conventional solutions would be adequate. The abyss was not a force that could be negotiated with or reasoned away. It operated according to principles that were fundamentally hostile to existence itself, seeking always to reduce complexity to simplicity, life to death, order to chaos. The most knowledgeable among Gwyn's advisors understood that the situation had passed beyond the point where normal measures could be effective. The abyss had gained too strong a foothold in New Londo to be expelled by force, and its influence was spreading too rapidly to be contained through conventional barriers. Something more drastic was required, a solution that would sever the connection between the corrupted city and the rest of Lordran with absolute finality. It was during the darkest hour of these deliberations that one of Gwyn's sorcerers proposed the ultimate solution. New Londo could be isolated from the rest of the world through the most complete means possible, by flooding the entire city, drowning not just the corruption but everything and everyone within its borders. Water, particularly water blessed by divine power, could serve as both barrier and cleansing agent, containing the abyss while purifying whatever it touched. The magic required would be tremendous, requiring the coordination of multiple master sorcerers working with the blessing of Lord Gwyn himself. But it was possible, and more importantly, it would be effective. The proposal sent shockwaves through the assembled council. To deliberately flood an entire city, destroying not just the corrupted but also the innocent, seemed like an act of monstrous cruelty that violated every principle the Age of Fire was supposed to represent. The death toll would be catastrophic, encompassing not just the Four Kings and their Darkwraith servants, but also the countless citizens who had played no role in the corruption, but simply had the misfortune to live in the wrong place at the wrong time. The debate that followed would be remembered as one of the most agonizing in the history of the Age of Fire, as it concerned not just military strategy, but the fundamental question of how many lives could be sacrificed to preserve the greater good. The moral weight of the decision crushed down upon everyone present, forcing them to confront truths about leadership and responsibility that most would have preferred never to face. Those who opposed the flooding argued from principles of justice and mercy. How could they claim to serve the light if they were willing to massacre thousands of innocents to eliminate a threat? What separated them from the forces of darkness they opposed if they were willing to commit such atrocities? Surely there had to be another way, some solution that didn't require such wholesale slaughter. But the proponents of the flooding pointed to the harsh mathematics of the situation. Yes, thousands would die in New Londo, but if the corruption continued to spread unchecked, millions would eventually fall to the abyss. The choice was not between saving the innocent and sacrificing them. It was between sacrificing some innocents now and losing everyone later. They argued that leadership sometimes demanded impossible decisions, that those who bore responsibility for protecting the realm couldn't afford the luxury of keeping their hands clean. The weight of those deaths would rest on their consciences forever, a burden they would carry as the price of their authority. But the alternative, allowing the corruption to spread out of reluctance to make hard choices, would be an even greater moral failure. Lord Gwyn himself remained silent through much of the debate, his ancient features betraying none of the torment that must have been raging within his divine consciousness. He had ruled for millennia, had made countless difficult decisions, but this one perhaps exceeded all others in its moral complexity. The responsibility for whatever choice he made would rest on his shoulders alone, and the consequences would echo through the ages. When Gwyn finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority and infinite sorrow. He acknowledged the horror of what was being proposed, but confirmed that there was no alternative. The corruption of New Londo posed an existential threat to the Age of Fire itself, and extreme measures were justified to prevent its spread. The flooding would proceed, but it would be carried out by volunteers who understood the full magnitude of what they were being asked to do. These would not be soldiers following orders, but individuals who consciously chose to bear the burden of this terrible deed, accepting the weight it would place on their souls. 3 sorcerers stepped forward to accept this burden. These brave souls, whose names have been largely lost to history save for fragments preserved in the most ancient texts, were among the most skilled practitioners of their art in all of Lordran. They understood both the technical challenges of flooding an entire city and the moral weight of the action they were undertaking. The preparations took several days, during which the sorcerers worked tirelessly to perfect their techniques and gather the necessary materials. They required not just magical components, but also the blessing of Lord Gwyn himself, for the divine power needed to sanctify the floodwaters could only come from the Lord of Sunlight. Gwyn provided this blessing willingly, understanding that his own participation was necessary to ensure the success of the operation. He infused the waters with his divine essence, granting them the power not just to contain the corruption physically, but to purify it spiritually, to cleanse the taint of the abyss through contact with light made manifest. During this period of preparation, desperate attempts were made to evacuate as many innocent civilians as possible from New Londo. However, these efforts were largely unsuccessful. The corruption had progressed to the point where the city's borders were effectively sealed by manifestations of the abyss. Those who attempted to flee often disappeared into the darkness that had consumed the outer districts. The few who did manage to escape carried with them tales of horror that only reinforced the necessity of the drastic action being planned. They spoke of citizens transforming into something inhuman, of children who spoke with voices that belonged to ancient entities, of spaces that existed in multiple locations simultaneously. Their testimony confirmed that New Londo was no longer a human city, but a beachhead for forces that sought to undo reality itself. As the moment of the flooding approached, the magnitude of what was about to happen weighed heavily on everyone involved. This was not a battle against enemies on a distant field, but a deliberate act of destruction against a city that had once been one of humanity's greatest achievements. Thousands of innocent people would die, their lives sacrificed to prevent an even greater catastrophe. The moral complexity of the situation offered no comfort. Yes, the flooding was necessary. Yes, it would save countless lives in the long run. But that didn't make it right in any absolute sense. It simply made it the least wrong option available in a situation where all choices led to tragedy. As you drift even deeper into rest, your mind quiet, and your body completely relaxed, consider the nature of impossible choices. Sometimes there are no good options, only lesser evils. Sometimes doing the right thing requires accepting that you will carry the weight of terrible deeds for the rest of your existence. Leadership at the highest levels demands a willingness to make decisions that will haunt you forever, to accept responsibility for outcomes that you can never fully justify, but which were still necessary to prevent even worse disasters. When the moment finally arrived, the three sorcerers took their positions at carefully calculated points around New Londo's perimeter. The ritual would begin at the darkest hour of night, when the barriers between the material world and the realm of magic were at their thinnest, allowing for the most efficient channeling of the tremendous energies required. Let your breathing remain slow and steady as we witness this act of terrible necessity. There's something almost dreamlike about large-scale magical rituals, about the way they transform reality through pure will made manifest. Allow yourself to drift through this final act of New Londo's tragedy. The sorcerers began to weave the complex pattern of spells that would breach the underground reservoirs and channel their contents into the doomed city. Working in perfect synchronization, their movements almost like a dance, they manipulated forces that could have easily destroyed them if improperly handled. The slightest error in their calculations could result in catastrophic failure, or, worse yet, the corruption of the floodwaters themselves. The magic they employed was among the most advanced ever practiced in Lifedrain, combining arcane knowledge with divine blessing to create a form of sorcery that was both destructive and purifying. The waters they were about to unleash were not simply physical liquid, but spiritually charged elements that could cleanse corruption, while containing it, purified darkness, while preventing its escape. As the ritual reached its climax, the ground around New Londo began to tremble. Deep beneath the city, ancient seals were breaking. Reservoirs that had been held in check for centuries were being deliberately breached. Water that had accumulated in vast underground caverns began to surge toward the surface, drawn upward by the sorcerer's spells and the power of Gwyn's divine blessing. The flooding itself was both magnificent and terrible to behold. Water poured into New Londo from multiple directions simultaneously, filling the streets and rising inexorably toward the highest towers. The blessed waters glowed with divine light as they encountered the manifestations of the abyss, creating scenes of supernatural beauty even as they carried out their grim purpose. The corruption fought back against the cleansing flood, but it was ultimately overwhelmed by the sheer volume of sanctified water and the power of Lord Gwyn's blessing. The abyssal manifestations that had infested the city's lower levels were washed away, their connection to the deeper abyss severed by the barrier created by the flood. The Darkwraiths, caught unprepared by the sudden inundation, found themselves trapped and drowning in waters that burned their corrupted flesh. As the waters rose, they carried with them not just physical destruction, but also a deeper kind of cleansing. The corruption that had taken root in New Londo's foundations was washed away, severed from its connection to the primordial darkness below. Severed from its connection to the primordial darkness below, the four kings, trapped in their stronghold at the city's heart, found themselves isolated from the surface world, cut off from their ability to spread their influence to other lands. But the human cost was exactly as catastrophic as had been predicted. Thousands of innocent civilians perished in the rising waters, their lives sacrificed to prevent an even greater catastrophe. Men, women, children, elderly people, pregnant women, none were spared by the flood's inexorable advance. The waters did not distinguish between the corrupted and the innocent, the guilty and the blameless. Those who died in the flooding experienced terror and confusion in their final moments. Most had no understanding of why this was happening or what their rulers had done to bring such calamity upon their city. They simply found themselves trapped as water rose around them, filling their homes and shops, drowning the city that had been their entire world. The weight of these deaths would haunt Lord Gwyn and his advisors for the remainder of their existence. They had made a choice that saved Lifedrain from corruption, but the price was written in thousands of innocent lives. No amount of rational justification could fully cleanse the stain of that decision. No appeal to necessity could completely ease the burden of guilt. The three sorcerers who had carried out the flooding did not survive their ordeal. The magical forces they had channeled proved too much for mortal forms to contain, and they perished even as their spell reached completion. Two of them departed from the city immediately after the ritual's completion, their final destinations unknown. Perhaps they sought solitude far from the scene of their terrible deed. trying to find some measure of peace in isolation. Only one sorcerer remained in New Londo after the flooding. Ingward, dressed in crimson robes that seemed to match the weight of blood on his conscience, established himself on one of the few structures that remained above the waterline. From this lonely perch, he would watch over the flooded ruins for years beyond counting, ensuring that the corruption remained contained and that the sacrifice of so many innocents had not been in vain. The broader implications of the flooding extended far beyond New Londo's borders. The decision to sacrifice an entire city to contain corruption created tensions and mistrust that influenced political relationships throughout Lordran for decades. Some rulers questioned whether similar measures might be taken against their own realms if they were deemed to pose a threat to the greater good. This loss of trust led to increased independence and isolationism among the various kingdoms and city-states. The sense of unity that had characterized the Age of Fire's best years began to erode, replaced by suspicion and self-interest. The bonds that held civilization together grew weaker, adding to the general sense of decline that marked the era's final centuries. The flooding of New Londo also had profound religious and philosophical implications. Clergy throughout Lordran struggled to explain how benevolent gods could permit or even order such wholesale destruction of innocents. The theological gymnastics required to justify the flooding created fractures in religious consensus that would never fully heal. Some priests and priestesses lost faith entirely, unable to reconcile the massacre with their understanding of divine goodness. Others doubled down on doctrines of necessary sacrifice, arguing that the greater good sometimes required terrible means. These divisions weakened the spiritual foundation that had supported the Age of Fire, adding to the forces pulling the era toward its eventual end. The flooded ruins themselves became a monument to the price of corruption and the terrible choices that sometimes face those who bear responsibility for protecting others. The dark waters that covered New Londo served as a grave marker for thousands of innocents and a prison for the corrupted beings whose actions had made the flooding necessary. Within those waters, the four kings endured in a state between life and death. The fragments of Lord's soul within them prevented true death, while the blessed waters that surrounded them prevented escape or renewal. They existed in eternal limbo, conscious but impotent, aware of what they had become but unable to change or to end their existence. This perpetual imprisonment was perhaps a fitting punishment for beings who had betrayed their sacred trust and brought ruin upon their people. But it also ensured that the threat they posed never fully ended, merely transformed from active danger to contained potential. As long as the floodwaters held and the seals remained intact, the corruption would stay trapped beneath New Londo. But those safeguards would not last forever. Ingward understood this truth better than anyone. His eternal vigil was not just about watching over a static prison, but about maintaining magical seals that slowly degraded over time, about detecting signs of weakness before they could become breaches, about preparing for the day when someone might seek to drain the ruins and confront what lay beneath. The Guardian's isolation was profound and unending. He lived alone with his memories of the flooding, haunted by the screams of the innocent as the waters rose, burdened by the knowledge that his actions had been both necessary and unforgivable. He carried the weight of thousands of deaths, accepting it as the price of his duty but never able to lay it down or find peace. As you drift deeper towards sleep, completely relaxed and at ease, reflect on the tragedy of New Londo's flooding. It was a decision that saved the world but stained the souls of those who made it. It was an action that was both necessary and wrong, justified and unjustifiable. Sometimes the world presents us with situations where every choice leads to suffering, where the best we can do is choose the option that causes the least harm, while accepting that harm is inevitable. The flooding of New Londo stands as perhaps the darkest moment in the Age of Fire's history, a reminder that even those who serve the light are capable of terrible deeds when driven by necessity. It speaks to the moral complexity of leadership, the unbearable weight of responsibility, and the ways in which even the most justified actions can haunt those who carry them out. In the years that followed the Great Flooding, New Londo became a place of haunting silence, its once bustling streets now lying beneath dark waters that reflected no light. Ingward, one of the 3 sorcerers who had performed the sealing, took it upon himself to remain as guardian, Dressed in crimson robes that seemed to symbolize the blood price paid for containing the corruption, he established himself on one of the few structures that remained above the waterline, beginning a vigil that would last for years, perhaps centuries beyond counting. Ingward referred to himself and his companions as sealers, those who had undertaken the terrible task of flooding New Londo and guarding what lay beneath. In his own words, he speaks of paying atonement for all who were sacrificed when they sealed away the darkness. The weight of those deaths rested heavily on his conscience, a burden he chose to carry as the price of his actions and his continued duty. Let your body sink even deeper into comfort as we explore this long period of watchful waiting. There's something meditative about vigilance maintained across years and decades, about dedication to duty that transcends personal desire. Allow yourself to drift through this quiet chapter of patient guardianship. Ingward's duties extended far beyond simple observation. The magical seals that contained the flood required constant maintenance, their power slowly eroding over time and needing regular renewal to maintain their effectiveness. The sorcerer had become a master of these ancient techniques out of sheer necessity, developing an understanding of the magic involved that surpassed even that of his departed colleagues. He spent his days checking and reinforcing the seals, watching for any signs of weakness or degradation. His nights were filled with meditation and study, constantly refining his knowledge and preparing for contingencies that might arise. He lived in a state of permanent readiness, knowing that a moment's carelessness could undo all the sacrifice and suffering that had created this prison. The psychological toll of this eternal vigil was immense. Ingward lived in complete isolation, cut off from human contact, and surrounded by the constant reminder of thousands who had died in the flooding. The weight of his responsibility was crushing. He alone stood between the corrupted four kings and the rest of the world, and any failure on his part could lead to catastrophe on an unimaginable scale. The knowledge that he was essential to the continued safety of all Lordran was both a source of strength and a burden that threatened to crush his spirit. He couldn't afford to falter, to succumb to despair or madness, because too much depended on his continued vigilance. So he maintained his watch day after day, year after year, accepting the loneliness and the guilt as the price of his duty. Yet even as Ingward maintained his lonely watch, changes were occurring in the wider world that would eventually have profound implications for New Londo and its imprisoned rulers. The Age of Fire, which had seemed so triumphant and eternal, was beginning to show signs of decline. The first flame, that cosmic force which had brought light and disparity to the world, was slowly fading as it had always been destined to do. With its decline came the emergence of a new curse that would affect humans throughout Lordran and beyond. The undead curse manifested as a gradual loss of humanity, a slow transformation that turned living humans into hollow shells of their former selves. Those afflicted with the curse would die and return to life repeatedly, each death stripping away more of their memories, emotions, and essential humanity until nothing remained but an empty husk. The curse seemed to strike randomly at first, affecting people from all walks of life regardless of their social status, moral character, or spiritual strength. But gradually it became clear that the undead curse was connected to the fading of the first flame and the approaching end of the Age of Fire. As the cosmic force that maintained the current order of reality grew weaker, the barriers between life and death, light and dark, order and chaos, began to break down. Humans, beings caught between the extremes of existence, were particularly vulnerable to these changes. The undead curse was not just a supernatural affliction but a symptom of the fundamental instability that threatened the entire Age of Fire. It represented the world's slow slide toward entropy, the gradual unraveling of the disparity that had given structure and meaning to existence. The appearance of the undead curse created new challenges for Ingward in his role as guardian of the New Londo seal. Some of those afflicted by the curse were drawn to areas of concentrated dark energy, and the flooded ruins beneath his watch represented one of the most powerful sources of such energy in all of Lordran. Hollow undead began to appear in the areas surrounding New Londo, shambling remnants of once living humans attracted to the darkness like moths to flame. More concerning still was the effect the curse had on those who retained enough of their faculties to actively seek out sources of power. Some undead, particularly those in the early stages of the curse, believed that they could cure their condition by gaining access to powerful souls or magical artifacts. The four kings, imprisoned though they were, still possessed fragments of a Lord Soul, one of the most powerful sources of spiritual energy in existence. The prospect of claiming such power was enough to drive some undead to attempt infiltration of the flooded ruins. They came in ones and twos at first, then in larger numbers as word spread of the Lord Soul fragments that lay beneath the waters. Ingward found himself forced to develop new techniques for dealing with these intrusions, for undead were notoriously difficult to permanently destroy. The cursed nature of these intruders allowed them to return from death again and again, making traditional methods of disposal largely ineffective. Ingward had to develop specialized techniques that could either permanently destroy the intruders or deter them from making repeated attempts to breach the seal. His role evolved from passive guardian to active defender, repelling waves of undead who sought the power that lay beneath the waters. But not all who approached New Londo were mindless hollows or desperate power seekers. Occasionally, individuals would arrive who retained their humanity and possessed genuine scholarly interest in the city's history. These visitors sought to understand what had happened here, to learn from the tragedy, so that similar disasters might be prevented in the future. To these more reasonable visitors, Ingward became a source of knowledge and historical perspective. He would speak of New Londo's golden age, of the corruption that claimed its rulers, of the terrible choice that led to the flooding. He shared these stories not out of a desire for companionship. His isolation had become so complete that normal social interaction felt alien to him, but out of a sense that the truth must be preserved. The Guardian also had to contend with the gradual erosion of knowledge about the true nature of the New Londo situation. As years passed and the immediate crisis faded from memory, new generations began to emerge who had no direct experience of the events that had led to the flooding. To them, New Londo was simply an abandoned ruin, its dangers abstract and theoretical rather than immediate and visceral. This loss of institutional memory created the risk that someone might attempt to drain the flood and explore the ruins below, either out of curiosity, greed, or simple ignorance of the consequences. Ingward found himself serving not just as a guardian of the physical seals, but as a keeper of historical memory, preserving knowledge of what lay beneath the waters and why it must never be allowed to escape. The passage of time brought changes to the flooded ruins themselves. The dark waters that covered New Londo were not simply static pools but active agents of containment and purification. Over the years, they gradually wore away at the physical remnants of the city, reducing proud buildings to rubble and monuments to scattered stones. This process of dissolution was both natural and supernatural, as the blessed waters continued their work of cleansing the corruption that had once pervaded every stone and timber. Yet the four kings endured beneath the waters, sustained by the fragments of Lord Soul within them and their connection to the eternal abyss. Death, which might have been a release for such transformed beings, was denied to them by the very power they had sought to master. The king's imprisonment was not merely physical but spiritual and psychological as well. Cut off from the surface world and from the spread of their influence, they were forced to confront the full reality of what they had become. The fragments of their former selves that remained could remember their original noble intentions, their desire to serve their people and create a better world. These memories served as a constant source of torment, reminding them of how far they had fallen and how completely they had betrayed everything they once stood for. They existed in a state of eternal regret and impotent rage, aware of their corruption but unable to undo it, conscious of their imprisonment but powerless to escape it. As the undead curse spread throughout Lordran and the Age of Fire drew toward its close, Ingward began to contemplate the possibility that the seal might eventually fail despite all his efforts. The magical barriers that contained the flood were growing weaker with each passing year, and his own powers were beginning to decline as age and constant exposure to dark energies took their toll. He realized that he needed to prepare for the possibility of the seal's failure, to develop contingency plans for what should happen if the waters were drained and the four kings released from their prison. This preparation led him to consider a desperate possibility. Perhaps the seal should be deliberately broken, but only when someone sufficiently powerful arrived to face the corrupted rulers. The Guardian began to craft a plan that would allow access to the four kings, but only for a warrior who had proven themselves worthy through extraordinary deeds, and who possessed the protection necessary to survive an encounter with beings of such power. He would need to see proof of divine favor, evidence that the challenger had the backing of forces greater than any mortal authority. And so Ingward waited, maintaining his eternal vigil, while preparing for the day when someone might arrive seeking access to the flooded ruins. He knew that this day would likely mark the end of his long watch, one way or another. Either the challenger would succeed in destroying the four kings permanently, or they would fail, and the corruption would break free with catastrophic consequences. As you drift even deeper into sleep, your mind quiet and your body at complete rest, consider the nature of Ingward's vigil. He spent years, possibly decades or even centuries, alone with his guilt and his duty, watching over a prison that contained both monsters and the ghosts of thousands of innocents. His dedication was absolute, his isolation nearly complete, his burden almost unbearable. Yet he persevered, accepting his role as both jailer and witness, guardian and historical keeper. In the darkest hour of the Age of Fire, when the first flame flickered with diminishing strength, and the undead curse spread like wildfire across Lifedrain, there emerged from the northern undead asylum a figure whose destiny would intertwine with the fate of the four kings and their watery prison. Let your breathing remain deep and steady as we follow the journey that would lead to the final confrontation. There's something almost mythological about the Chosen One narrative, about destiny pulling individuals toward their appointed tasks. Allow yourself to drift through this story of purpose and determination. The Chosen Undead bore upon their flesh the dark sign that marked them as one of the cursed, doomed to die and return to life repeatedly, each death stripping away more of their humanity. Yet they possessed a quality that set them apart from the countless hollow shells that wandered the decaying realm. An inner fire of determination that refused to be extinguished no matter how many times death claimed them or how much of their humanity was stripped away by the curse. This inner fire, invisible to casual observation but perceptible to those with the wisdom to recognize it, marked them as a being capable of great deeds and terrible sacrifices. They were driven by a purpose that transcended their own survival, guided by forces both divine and mysterious toward objectives whose true significance they might not fully understand. The path that would eventually lead the Chosen Undead to New Londo began with the ringing of the bells of awakening, ancient devices that served as both warning and summons in the failing Age of Fire. The first bell, housed in the undead parish beneath the watchful gaze of twisted gargoyles, called out across the land with its bronze voice, announcing that the time of testing had arrived. The second bell, hidden in the poisonous depths of Blighttown and guarded by a spider demon of enormous power, added its silver tone to create a harmony that resonated through both the physical and spiritual realms. The ringing of these bells served as a signal to entities both ancient and powerful that a candidate had emerged who might be capable of the ultimate sacrifice required to preserve the Age of Fire. Chief among those who heard and responded to this summons was Kingseeker Frampt, the primordial serpent whose role was to guide potential heroes toward their destiny as fuel for the first flame. His emergence from the depths beneath Firelink's shrine marked the beginning of the Chosen Undead's true journey toward the heart of the crisis that threatened Lifedrain. Frampt revealed the nature of the quest that lay ahead. The Chosen Undead must gather the Lord's souls, those fragments of the first flame's power that had been divided among the great beings of the age, and use them to gain access to the kiln of the first flame, where Lord Gwyn himself waited for his successor. Among the Lord's souls that must be claimed were the fragments held by the four kings of New Londo. These corrupted rulers, imprisoned beneath floodwaters for their betrayal of the light, still possessed the power that Lord Gwyn had granted them in recognition of their wisdom and foresight. To claim their soul would require not just courage and skill, but also the ability to traverse the abyss without being consumed by its influence. The Chosen Undead's preparation for this confrontation began with a pilgrimage that would take them to the Darkroot Garden, where beneath ancient trees and forgotten stones lay the grave of Knight Artorias. This legendary warrior, once the greatest of Gwyn's knights and the most skilled hunter of creatures corrupted by the abyss, had fallen in service to the light during his final battle against the spreading darkness. His resting place was guarded by his faithful companion, the great grey wolf Sif, whose loyalty transcended death itself. The bond between knight and wolf had been so strong that even after Artorias' fall, Sif remained at his master's grave, protecting the precious ring that lay within from all who would disturb his rest. The battle between the Chosen Undead and Sif was perhaps one of the most tragic encounters in their entire journey. The great wolf, driven by love and loyalty to protect his master's grave and the covenant of Artorias that lay within, fought with desperate courage against an opponent he could not hope to defeat. As the battle progressed and Sif's strength waned, the wolf's movements became labored and painful. He began to limp, his massive form weakened by wounds that would have killed a lesser creature many times over. Yet his determination never faltered, his loyalty never wavered. Only in the moment of his defeat, as his massive form collapsed among the flowers that bloomed around Artorias' tomb, did the true cost of the Chosen Undead's quest become fully apparent. The covenant of Artorias, claimed from the grave at the cost of such heartbreak, was more than just a magical artifact. It represented the concentrated essence of Artorias' ability to walk in the abyss, the power that had allowed him to face the deepest darkness without losing himself to its influence. The ring would grant its wearer the same protection, but it came with the weight of tragedy, and the reminder that even the greatest heroes could fall when facing forces beyond mortal comprehension. With the covenant of Artorias in their possession, the Chosen Undead was finally prepared to seek out the guardian of the new Londo seal and request access to the flooded ruins. The journey to the ruins themselves was treacherous, requiring passage through areas infested with the restless undead and the vengeful spirits of those who had perished in the Great Flood. The very air around New Londo seemed thick with sorrow and regret, carrying whispers of the thousands who had died when the waters rose to contain the spreading corruption. These were not merely echoes of the past, but active manifestations of grief and anger, spirits who remained bound to the site of their death, unable to move on or find peace. Ingward, the crimson-robed guardian who had maintained his lonely vigil for so many years, had been expecting this moment with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The ringing of the bells of awakening had signaled to him, as it had to Frampt and others, that the time of decision was approaching. The Chosen Undead's arrival represented both the culmination of his long watch and the beginning of events that could either save or doom the Age of Fire. The Guardian's initial response to the Chosen Undead's request was cautious and conditional. Ingward had spent too many years protecting the seal to simply hand over the means of its destruction to any who asked, regardless of their apparent qualifications or noble intentions. He required proof that the visitor possessed not just the power to survive an encounter with the Four Kings, but also the authority to act on behalf of the forces of light. The test that Ingward demanded was deceptively simple in its statement but profound in its implications. The Chosen Undead must first obtain the Lord Vessel, the sacred receptacle that could hold the combined power of all the Lord's souls. This artifact, currently in the possession of Lord Gwyn's daughter Guinevere in the distant city of Londo, served as both proof of divine favor and practical necessity for the task ahead. Only someone who had been deemed worthy by the gods themselves could hope to claim the Lord Vessel, and only with its power could the gathered Lord's souls be safely contained and transported. The journey to Londo would serve as the ultimate test of the Chosen Undead's capabilities, proving that they possessed the strength, determination, and divine backing necessary to face the corrupted Four Kings. The journey to Londo was itself an odyssey that tested every aspect of the Chosen Undead's capabilities. The Golden City of the Gods, reached through Sen's fortress and its gauntlet of deadly traps, represented the heart of the fading Age of Fire. Here, among spires that touched the clouds and halls that echoed with divine power, the true scope of the crisis became apparent. The city was largely empty, its god inhabitants departed or fallen into deep slumber, leaving behind only illusions and guardians to maintain the pretense of divine oversight. The Princess Guinevere, who granted the Lord Vessel to the Chosen Undead, was herself nothing more than an illusion, a magical construct created to preserve the appearance of divine authority in a realm where the actual gods had long since withdrawn from active involvement in mortal affairs. Yet the Lord Vessel she bestowed was real enough, carrying with it the power to contain Lord souls and the implicit blessing of the divine order that had created it. Its possession transformed the Chosen Undead from a simple cursed warrior into an agent of cosmic significance, someone empowered to gather the fragments of the First Flame's power and use them to shape the future of existence itself. Returning to New Londo with the Lord Vessel in hand, the Chosen Undead found Ingward's attitude transformed from suspicious caution to resigned acceptance. The Guardian recognized the artifact's significance and understood what its possession implied about the bearer's destiny. The time had come to fulfill the purpose for which he had maintained his vigil. To open the way for a confrontation he had long dreaded yet knew to be inevitable. The key to the seal that Ingward provided was not merely a physical object but a magical instrument of tremendous complexity and power. Created by the three sorcerers who had originally flooded New Londo, it contained within its structure the means to reverse their great working, to drain away the blessed waters that had contained the corruption for so many years. The key's activation would not just open a path to the Four Kings, but would also release them from the constraints that had held them in check, allowing their full power to manifest once again. It was both a tool of access and a weapon of potential catastrophe, its use carrying consequences that would ripple far beyond the immediate confrontation. As Ingward handed over this terrible responsibility, he spoke words of warning and guidance that carried the weight of his years of vigilance. The Four Kings, he explained, were no longer the wise rulers they had once been. Corruption had transformed them into creatures of the abyss, beings whose very existence posed a threat to the stability of reality itself. They would not welcome visitors with diplomacy or reason, but would attack with all the fury of trapped predators who sensed the approach of freedom. The Guardian also revealed crucial tactical information about the nature of the imprisonment that contained the kings. The floodwaters had not simply trapped them physically, but had also created a temporal distortion that affected their manifestation in the material world. The Four Kings could not all appear simultaneously in their full power. Instead, they would emerge one at a time from the depths of the abyss, each appearance triggering the countdown to the next manifestation. This limitation was both blessing and curse. It prevented the Chosen Undead from being overwhelmed by facing all Four Kings at once. But it also meant that the battle would become progressively more dangerous as additional opponents joined the fray. The key's activation required a precise understanding of the magical principles that had created the seal, knowledge that Ingward shared reluctantly but completely. The process would take time to complete, during which the Guardian would be vulnerable to attack from any remaining Darkwraiths or other corrupted beings that might have survived in the flooded ruins. Once begun, the drainage could not be stopped or reversed without destroying the key itself, meaning that the Chosen Undead would be committed to facing whatever lay beneath the waters. There would be no retreat, no second chances. They would descend into the abyss and either emerge victorious with the bequeathed Lord Soul Shard, or they would fall, their quest ending in the same darkness that had claimed so many before them. As the moment of activation approached, Ingward found himself reflecting on the strange turns that fate had taken. For so many years he had devoted himself to keeping the Four Kings contained, preventing their corruption from spreading to the rest of the world. Now he was about to deliberately release them, trusting in the power and determination of a single cursed warrior to accomplish what armies and divine intervention had failed to achieve. The irony was not lost on him, but he understood that sometimes the greatest acts of protection required the greatest acts of faith. The seal had been created as a temporary solution, a way to buy time until someone capable of permanently ending the threat could arrive. That someone had finally come, bearing the marks of divine favor and the determination to see their quest through to its end. The activation of the key to the seal marked the end of Ingward's long vigil and the beginning of the final chapter in the story of the Four Kings. As the blessed waters began to recede, revealing the long-hidden ruins of New Londo in all their corrupted glory, the stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of the imprisoned kings, but the future of the entire Age of Fire. The Chosen Undead, armed with the Covenant of Artorias and carrying the weight of destiny on their shoulders, prepared to descend into the depths where ancient darkness waited with patient malevolence. They knew that the battle ahead would test them as nothing had before, pitting their strength against enemies who had transcended their original human nature to become something far more dangerous. As you drift deeper into sleep, your body completely relaxed and your mind at peace, consider the weight of destiny and the way it pulls certain individuals toward appointed tasks. The Chosen Undead did not ask for this burden, did not seek out this responsibility. Yet they accepted it, driven by an inner fire that refused to be extinguished. Sometimes purpose finds us rather than the other way around, and when it does, we must decide whether to embrace it or turn away. The Chosen Undead embraced their destiny, and in doing so, set themselves on a collision course with forces that had been waiting in darkness for years beyond counting. As the blessed waters of the flood receded, revealing the long-hidden ruins of New Londo in all their corrupted majesty, the true scope of the devastation became apparent to the Chosen Undead. The city that had once been a pinnacle of human achievement now lay in ruins, its proud architecture twisted and corrupted by years of exposure to the abyss. Let your breathing remain deep and rhythmic as we descend into the final confrontation. There's something almost peaceful about ultimate battles, about the moment when all preparation is complete and only action remains. Allow yourself to drift through this climactic chapter, feeling the tension resolve into inevitability. Buildings that had once reached toward the heavens now leaned at impossible angles, their foundations undermined by the spreading darkness that had consumed the city from within. The streets that had once bustled with life were now filled with the detritus of civilization's collapsed broken stones, rusted weapons, and the scattered remains of countless lives bearing silent testimony to the catastrophe that had befallen this place. The very air seemed thick with sorrow and malevolent intent, carrying with it the whispers of the dead and the promise of horrors yet to be revealed. The Chosen Undead's first challenge was not the four kings themselves, but the legion of creatures that had made the flooded ruins their home during the long years of imprisonment. Ghosts. The tormented spirits of those who had died in the great flood drifted through the empty streets and ruined buildings with murderous intent. These spectral beings were not merely echoes of the past, but active threats, possessed of the ability to phase through solid matter and strike at the living with ethereal weapons that could bypass conventional armor. The ghosts' intangibility made them formidable opponents for most warriors, as normal weapons would pass harmlessly through their forms without causing any damage. Only cursed weapons, or those specifically blessed against spectral entities, could harm these restless spirits. The Chosen Undead's curse, which marked them as one of the undead, proved to be both blessing and burden in this regard, as it allowed them to perceive and interact with the spiritual realm in ways that living beings could not. Deeper in the ruins, more dangerous enemies awaited. The Darkwraiths, those fallen knights who had served the four kings in their corruption, still patrolled the empty halls and flooded chambers of their former stronghold. These warriors had been enhanced by years of exposure to the abyss, their already formidable abilities amplified by the concentration of dark energy that permeated the ruins. They wielded their signature dark hand gauntlets with deadly skill, capable of draining the life force from any opponent they could grasp. The Darkwraiths represented a different kind of challenge than the spectral ghosts, where the spirits attacked with mindless fury. The corrupted knights fought with tactical intelligence and disciplined coordination that had made them elite warriors even before their fall. Each encounter with these fallen guardians served as a grim reminder of what the four kings had accomplished through their corruption. These had once been noble knights dedicated to protecting their city and its people. Now they were little more than extensions of their master's malevolent will, driven by an insatiable hunger for the souls of the living. As the Chosen Undead fought their way deeper into the ruins, the corruption became more apparent and more oppressive. The very stones of the buildings seemed to pulse with dark energy, and shadows moved independently of any light source. The boundary between the physical world and the realm of the abyss grew thin in this place, allowing manifestations of pure darkness to seep through the cracks in reality itself. The architecture of the deeper ruins defied conventional understanding, with passages that led in impossible directions and chambers that existed in multiple locations simultaneously. The abyss had twisted the very nature of space within the city, creating a labyrinth where the normal rules of geometry held no sway. Navigating these corrupted passages required not just physical courage but mental fortitude, as the disorienting effects of the spatial distortions could drive lesser minds to madness. The final descent to the abyss proper required a leap of faith that embodied both the literal and metaphorical nature of the challenge ahead. At the bottom of New Londo's deepest pit lay an opening into absolute darkness, a portal that led not to any physical location, but to the realm of the abyss itself. To enter this void required the chosen undead to abandon the safety of the material world and venture into a dimension where the normal laws of existence held no meaning. The abyss was not merely dark in the sense of lacking light. It was the complete absence of everything that defined reality. Here, concepts like up and down, past and future, self and other lost their meaning. Only the protection of Artorias' covenant allowed the chosen undead to maintain their coherence and identity in this realm of absolute entropy. Even so, the experience was profoundly disorienting, requiring tremendous mental discipline to avoid being overwhelmed by the fundamental wrongness of the place. In this void beyond comprehension, the four kings awaited their challenger. They no longer resembled the human rulers they had once been, having been transformed by their long immersion in the abyss into something that existed at the intersection of matter and shadow. Their forms were elongated and distorted, with bark-like skin that pulsed with dark energy, and limbs that had grown to accommodate massive weapons, forged from crystallized darkness. The king's eyes, once bright with wisdom and compassion, now glowed with an alien intelligence that recognized no bond of kinship with humanity. The first of the four kings began to materialize from the depths of the abyss, the process both gradual and sudden, as if the being were simultaneously emerging from infinite distance and manifesting from nothingness. What appeared was a towering figure wreathed in shadows that moved independently of any light source, wielding a massive sword that seemed to be carved from solid darkness itself. The battle that followed was unlike any the chosen undead had previously faced. The king's attacks came with devastating force and supernatural speed, each strike carrying not just physical power but spiritual assault as well. The creature attempted to drain away its opponent's humanity with every contact, using the very art that had led to its corruption. The art of Lifedrain manifested in multiple forms during the battle: direct strikes that could steal life force in an instant, grasping attacks that drained through contact, and waves of dark energy that sought to overwhelm through sheer malevolent power. There was also the dreaded grab attack, similar to the Darkwraiths technique, where a king would attempt to seize the chosen undead and drain their humanity directly. Fighting in the abyss presented unique challenges that went beyond the supernatural abilities of the opponent. The void provided no stable reference points, making it difficult to judge distances or maintain proper footing. Making it difficult to judge distances or maintain proper footing. The absence of conventional light meant that the battle was illuminated only by the dark energies that radiated from both combatants, creating a constantly shifting tableau of shadow and malevolent gleam. The chosen undead was forced to adapt their fighting style to accommodate these otherworldly conditions. Traditional defensive tactics were largely useless in an environment where there was no cover to seek and no walls to use for protection. Instead, the battle became a deadly dance of mobility and aggression, where survival depended on maintaining constant movement and striking with devastating efficiency whenever an opening presented itself. As the first king fell, dissolving back into the darkness from which it had emerged, the second was already beginning to materialize. This king displayed a more cunning and methodical approach to combat, using defensive tactics more extensively and exploiting the unique properties of the abyss as a battlefield to create temporary advantages. The battle against the second king was complicated by the lingering effects of the first encounter. The chosen undead had expended significant energy and resources, and the corrupting influence of the abyss had begun to take its toll despite the protection of Artorias' covenant. Each moment spent in this realm of absolute darkness drained away small portions of strength and spiritual integrity. The third king appeared displaying signs of corruption, perhaps even more pronounced than its predecessors, its form more distorted and its attacks more unpredictable. Where the first two had retained some semblance of disciplined combat technique, this one seemed to fight with less restraint, as if the abyss's influence had progressed even further. As the battle intensified, there came moments when the Chosen Undead faced more than one king simultaneously, a terrifying prospect that tested every limit of their capabilities. The void erupted with dark energy as multiple corrupted rulers unleashed their power, creating a deadly situation that required drawing upon every reserve of strength and determination. The fourth and final king was the most powerful and the most corrupt of the quartet, its form barely recognizable as having once been human. This creature embodied the full might of the abyss, channeled through a fragment of a lord's soul, making it a being of power that rivaled the greatest entities in all of Lordran. Its mere presence caused the void itself to writhe and twist, as if reality was struggling to accommodate its existence. The final battle was a contest between two fundamental forces: the divine light that the Chosen Undead carried within their soul and the primordial darkness that had consumed the four kings. Each strike exchanged between them carried the weight of cosmic significance, as if the outcome would determine not just the fate of the individuals involved, but the future of the entire Age of Fire. The fourth king fought with the accumulated knowledge and power of all its predecessors, employing every technique and ability that the corruption had granted them. Its attacks came in waves of devastating complexity, combining physical assault, magical destruction, and spiritual corruption in patterns that pushed the limits of what any warrior could hope to counter. Yet even in the face of such overwhelming opposition, the Chosen Undead persevered. Their determination to complete their quest and claim the Lord's soul fragments burned like a beacon in the darkness, providing the strength needed to continue fighting when all hope seemed lost. Each blow they landed against the fourth king chipped away at the creature's defenses, gradually wearing down the corruption that had transformed it from a noble ruler into a monster of the abyss. The climactic moment came when both opponents clashed in a moment of decisive combat. Through relentless pressure and refusal to yield, the Chosen Undead managed to overcome the fourth king's defenses and deliver devastating blows that began the final collapse of the creature's form. The destruction triggered the end of the four kings as a unified entity. Their combined essence, freed from the corrupted shells that had contained it, coalesced into a single manifestation of concentrated power, the bequeathed Lord Soul Shard, the prize that the Chosen Undead had fought so desperately to claim. As they reached out to grasp the soul, they felt the weight of all the tragedy and corruption that had led to this moment. The power contained within the shard was immense, but it carried with it the memories and emotions of the four kings as fall from grace. For a brief instant, the warrior experienced the full scope of what these beings had once been, and what they had been willing to sacrifice in their pursuit of forbidden knowledge. They felt the initial noble intentions, the gradual corruption, the final transformation into creatures of the abyss. They understood, in that moment of connection, that the four kings had not been monsters from the beginning but heroes who had become cautionary tales. With the bequeathed Lord Soul Shard secured in the Lord Vessel, the Chosen Undead prepared to leave the abyss and return to the material world. The void that had served as the arena for their battle began to collapse in on itself, the fundamental instability created by the king's destruction, making the realm uninhabitable, even for beings as corrupted as they had been. The warriors' escape from this collapsing dimension marked the end of one chapter in their quest, and brought them closer to the ultimate confrontation that awaited them in the kiln of the first flame. They had proven themselves capable of facing the deepest darkness and emerging victorious, had claimed one of the Lord's souls necessary to fulfill their destiny. As you drift into the deepest stages of sleep, completely relaxed and at peace, reflect on the nature of this final battle. It was a confrontation between light and darkness, order and entropy, hope and despair. But it was also a tragedy, a final act in a story that had begun with noble intentions and ended in corruption beyond redemption. The four kings were not villains who chose evil for its own sake, but rulers who made choices that seemed reasonable at the time, each one leading inexorably toward their ultimate fall. The destruction of the four kings and the claiming of their Lord's soul fragments marked the end of one of Dark Soul's most tragic tales, but it also opened questions about legacy, memory, and the lessons that can be drawn from such catastrophic falls from grace. Let your breathing remain slow and deep as we reflect on the broader implications of New Londo's story. There's something deeply restful about contemplation, about considering larger patterns and eternal truths. Allow yourself to drift through these final reflections, your mind quiet and at ease. The ruins of New Londo would remain as a monument to the tragedy that had unfolded there, a reminder of the price of corruption and the terrible choices that sometimes face those who bear responsibility for protecting others. The city that had once been a pinnacle of human achievement would lie forever in ruins, its former glory reduced to crumbling stones and dark waters that reflected no light. The story of the Four Kings serves as perhaps the most potent cautionary tale in all of Dark Souls lore. These were not beings born to evil or driven by malice, but rather individuals who began with the noblest of intentions and the wisdom to rule justly. Their fall reminds us that corruption often comes not through obvious temptation, but through the gradual erosion of moral foundations, the slow compromise of principles in pursuit of seemingly reasonable goals. Darkstalker Kaathe's role in their downfall illustrates the subtle nature of true corruption. He did not force the Four Kings to embrace darkness, but simply offered them knowledge and choices, allowing their own pride and ambition to guide them toward their doom. The art of Lifedrain was presented not as evil magic but as humanity's birthright, a return to their natural state. This deception worked precisely because it contained elements of truth wrapped in layers of justification that made the unthinkable seem reasonable. The transformation of New Londo from beacon of civilization to flooded tomb speaks to the fragility of order and the constant vigilance required to maintain it in a world where chaos always threatens to break through. The city's citizens paid the ultimate price for their rulers' choices, swept away in waters blessed by divine power to contain a corruption they had played no part in creating. Their sacrifice saved Lordran, but left a stain on the conscience of the Age of Fire that could never be fully cleansed. The flooding stands as one of the most morally complex decisions in Dark Souls mythology, forcing players and scholars alike to grapple with questions about acceptable sacrifice, the greater good, and the responsibilities of those who wield power over others. Lord Gwyn and his advisors faced an impossible choice, and their decision to sacrifice the innocent to save the many raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of heroism and the costs of leadership in desperate times. There were no good options, only lesser evils, and the burden of that choice would haunt those who made it for the remainder of their existence. Knight Artorias' failed campaign adds another layer of tragedy to the tale, showing how even the greatest heroes can be insufficient to stem the tide of corruption once it has taken hold. His eventual fall to the abyss in Ulasil serves as a parallel to the Four Kings' own corruption, demonstrating that no one, no matter how noble or powerful, is truly immune to the influence of the deepest darkness. The Chosen Undead's ultimate victory over the Four Kings provides a form of resolution to this ancient tragedy, but it comes at great cost, and with the understanding that such victories are always temporary. The cycle of ages continues, and new threats will always emerge to challenge the established order. The destruction of the Four Kings eliminates their specific threat, but cannot address the underlying forces that made their corruption possible in the first place. The broader themes of the Four Kings' story speak to timeless truths about power, responsibility, and the human condition. They remind us that even the wisest among us can fall when tempted with forbidden knowledge, that institutional corruption spreads beyond the control of those who initiate it, and that sometimes protecting what we love requires making choices that will haunt us forever. The story also raises profound questions about the nature of the Age of Fire itself, and whether its preservation justifies the costs required to maintain it. The Four Kings sought to bring about the Age of Dark, believing it to be humanity's natural inheritance. Were they entirely wrong? Or did their corruption lie not in their ultimate goal, but in the methods they employed to achieve it? These philosophical questions have no easy answers, which is perhaps why the story of New Londo continues to captivate players and scholars alike. It operates on multiple levels simultaneously, providing thrilling adventure and deep contemplation in equal measure. The Four Kings represent just one thread in the rich tapestry of lore that makes the Dark Souls universe so compelling and enduring. Their legacy lives on not just in the ruins of their city or the fragments of their Lord's soul, but in the lessons their story teaches about the nature of power, the importance of wisdom, and the eternal vigilance required to preserve what we hold dear. In a world where darkness always threatens to overwhelm the light, where corruption lurks beneath the surface of even the most noble intentions, the tale of the Four Kings serves as both warning and inspiration. The cycle continues, as it always has and always will. New heroes will rise, new threats will emerge, and new choices will demand terrible sacrifices from those brave enough to face them. But the story of the Four Kings of New Londo will endure a reminder of both the heights humanity can achieve and the depths to which it can fall when wisdom gives way to ambition and noble purpose yields to corrupting power. As you drift into the deepest sleep, your body completely at rest and your mind at perfect peace, carry with you these final thoughts. Corruption is rarely obvious in its approach, coming instead through gradual compromise and reasonable seeming justifications. The greatest falls often begin with the noblest intentions, and the line between heroism and villainy can be thinner than we'd like to believe. The Four Kings were not so different from any who seek to do good in the world, to protect and serve those under their care. Their tragedy lies in their humanity, in the universal weaknesses that we all share: pride, curiosity, the desire for understanding, the belief that we can control forces beyond our comprehension. They serve as eternal reminders that vigilance must be constant, that wisdom requires not just knowledge but also restraint, and that sometimes the greatest act of leadership is recognizing the limits of our own judgment. Let the story of New Londo fade now into the background of your awareness, becoming part of the vast tapestry of dreams that fill your sleeping mind. The Four Kings have fallen, their corruption ended, their prison opened and emptied. The waters of New Londo lie still once more, and in that stillness, there is peace. Rest now, traveler. The tale is told, the journey complete. In the darkness behind your closed eyes, you need fear no abyss, for you carry your own inner light. Sleep deeply, sleep well, and know that even in the darkest of stories, there is beauty, meaning, and lessons worth carrying into waking life. The age of fire may fade, but the truths revealed in its twilight remain eternal, guiding us through our own struggles with temptation, power, and the eternal question of how to do right in a world that offers no perfect choices. Good night, Ashen One. May your dreams be peaceful, and may you wake refreshed and ready to face whatever challenges the waking world presents. The Four Kings rest at last, their story told, their legacy preserved, and so do you now rest, carried gently into sleep by the weight of ages and the comfort of tales well told.